What if Sumer wasn't the first civilization, but the first restart after something older drowned beneath the flood? What if everything you learned in school about human progress, that clean story of cave dwellers slowly inventing agriculture and writing in cities, what if all of it was backwards? What if we've been reading the evidence wrong, because accepting what it actually shows would mean rewriting everything we think we know about who we are and how long we've been capable of greatness? You're standing in a basement archive beneath the British Museum, London, where metal drawers stretch into shadows the fluorescent lights barely reach. The air tastes like dust and time. In your hand sits a clay tablet, no larger than your palm, pressed 4,000 years ago by fingers long since returned to dust. The surface is covered in wedge-shaped marks, cuneiform script, and the curator standing beside you is explaining what it contains. Mathematical calculations, astronomical observations. The synodic cycle of Venus tracked with precision, 584 days, accurate within hours. You ask the obvious question, the one that should have an obvious answer. When did the Sumerians develop this knowledge? How many generations of astronomers observed the sky, recorded data, refined calculations before they achieved this accuracy? The curator pauses. She looks at the tablet, then at you, and says something that makes the floor feel less solid beneath your feet. This knowledge appears complete from the very beginning. There are no earlier versions, no practice attempts, no evidence of a learning curve. The first astronomical tablets we have are already sophisticated, already accurate. It's as if someone turned on a light switch, and an entire advanced civilization simply appeared, already knowing things they shouldn't know, already capable of things they shouldn't be able to do. Around you in these climate-controlled drawers sit hundreds of thousands more tablets. Most have never been fully translated. Most have never been properly studied. They wait in darkness, while the knowledge they contain remains locked behind institutional priorities that favor maintaining comfortable narratives over pursuing uncomfortable evidence. But that tablet in your hands is whispering something urgent, something that matters right now, today, in ways that transcend academic curiosity about ancient history. The standard story of civilization is satisfying in its simplicity. Humans lived as hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years, following herds, surviving, slowly learning. Then around 10,000 BC, we discovered agriculture. Food surplus allowed populations to grow. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. Cities needed record-keeping, which led to writing. Knowledge accumulated across generations until we had civilization. It's linear, logical, and completely contradicted by what archaeologists actually find when they dig. Around 3200 BC, in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, Sumerian civilization appears in the archaeological record. If the linear story were true, we should find crude early attempts at urbanism, simple tools, experimental writing systems showing gradual development. Instead, archaeologists found perfection from the start. Cities housing tens of thousands laid out in precise grids, drainage systems engineered with mathematical sophistication, a writing system that appears fully formed, with complex grammar and extensive vocabulary. Mathematical calculations using base 60 that still governs how we measure time and angles today. There's no developmental phase, no mistakes, no evidence of a society learning how to build cities or developing writing through trial and error. Sumer appears suddenly, already sophisticated, as if implementing a design rather than inventing one. This pattern isn't unique to Sumer. In Egypt, the first dynasty emerges around 3100 BC, with monumental architecture and hieroglyphic writing already capable of expressing abstract concepts. The Indus Valley civilization appears around 2500 BC, with planned cities and standardized measurements. Each time we expect to find beginnings, we find competence. The refinement that should be visible in the archaeological record, the failed experiments and gradual improvements, they're absent. The learning happened somewhere else, at some time we can't document, or it didn't happen at all, because the knowledge was already complete when implementation began. If Sumer wasn't inventing but reconstructing, if these civilizations were working from inherited knowledge rather than starting from zero, then human history isn't a line climbing upward. It's a cycle. Rise, flourishing, catastrophe, collapse, dark age, recovery, and rise again. And if civilization has peaked before and fallen before, then the warnings the Sumerians pressed into clay with such desperate care aren't about their past. They're about our future, about the cycle we're still caught in, about what happens when we forget that progress isn't permanent, that knowledge is fragile, that everything we've built can be lost if we don't actively work to preserve it. If you stay with me through this journey, if you follow the thread from these clay tablets back through time to standing stones that shouldn't exist, and astronomical alignments that required knowledge supposedly unavailable to Stone Age peoples, you'll see something that changes everything. You'll understand why Sumer appears suddenly sophisticated. You'll understand why writing systems seem complete from their first appearance. You'll understand why the same symbols, the same myths, the same architectural principles appear in cultures separated by oceans they supposedly couldn't cross. And you'll understand that we're not the first to reach these heights. We're just the latest iteration in a pattern that has turned before and will turn again. Unless we finally learn the lesson that those who came before us tried so hard to teach. If you're listening right now, leave a comment about where you are in the world, what time it is, whether it's day or night outside your window. I want to know if the weight of deep time feels as heavy where you're sitting as it does here, among these tablets that remember what we've forgotten. Now, let's go back to 1922, to a trench in southern Iraq, where a British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley stood 6 feet below the desert surface, expecting to find crude beginnings, and instead found perfection that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Let's go to the place where the problem becomes impossible to ignore. Chapter 1. The Problem with the Timeline. You're standing in a trench in southern Iraq, 13 feet below the surface of what will one day be called the Royal Cemetery of Ur. The year is 1922. The sun is a white hammer against your back. Your hands are covered in dust that was once part of buildings, part of lives, part of a civilization that ended 4,000 years before you were born. Your name is Leonard Woolley, and you're a British archaeologist who came here expecting to find the crude beginnings of human civilization, the first stumbling attempts at urban life. You've been trained to expect a progression, a clear developmental sequence showing how simple villages slowly evolved into complex cities. You kneel down in the trench, your trowel scraping carefully through compacted earth. Around you, your workers are exposing foundations, walls, streets. The deeper you go, the older the layers become. That's how archaeology works. Time is vertical. The oldest remains sit at the bottom, covered by centuries of accumulated debris. And each layer should show progression, improvement, growing sophistication as you move upward through time toward the present. At least, that's the theory. That's what your professors taught you at Oxford. That's what every textbook says should happen. But what you're uncovering at this level, which radiocarbon dating will eventually place around 3200 BC, doesn't match those expectations. The streets are laid out in a grid pattern. Not a rough approximation of right angles, but precise geometry that would require surveying equipment and mathematical understanding to achieve. The drainage system isn't a simple ditch running down the middle of the road. It's an engineered network of clay pipes channeling water through calculated grades, preventing backflow, managing waste with principles that modern civil engineers recognize as fundamentally sound. The buildings don't have foundations sitting loosely on bedrock. They're cut deep, anchored with a confidence that speaks of long experience with structural principles and soil mechanics. You sit back on your heels, wiping sweat from your forehead, leaving a smear of ancient dust across your skin. Something is wrong. This isn't what early urbanism should look like. This is what mature urbanism looks like. The product of generations of experience, centuries of trial and error, accumulated wisdom about what works and what fails. But this is the earliest level of occupation you've found. Below this, there's nothing but virgin soil. Above this, the city continues for thousands of years, but it doesn't improve much on what you're seeing right here, right now, at the very beginning. The Sumerians didn't learn how to build cities over generations of gradual improvement. They started with a design that worked and simply maintained it. Your notebook lies open on a stone nearby, and as the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, you write words that will puzzle scholars for decades. It's as if the city was designed by experienced urban planners who knew exactly what they were doing from day one. You underline those last three words twice, pressing hard enough that the pencil nearly tears through the paper. From day one. No learning curve, no experimental phase, just competence, right from the start. The conventional narrative of human civilization, the one taught in universities and presented in museums worldwide, follows a predictable arc. For hundreds of thousands of years, anatomically modern humans existed as hunter-gatherers, living in small mobile bands, following animal migrations, gathering seasonal plants, slowly accumulating knowledge about their environment through careful observation and hard-won experience. This lifestyle was stable, sustainable, but it didn't allow for much in the way of technological advancement or population growth. You can't build cities when you have to move every few weeks. You can't develop complex social hierarchies when your entire community numbers 30 or 40 people. You can't create writing systems when there's nothing that needs to be written down that can't be more easily remembered and passed along through oral tradition. Then, according to this narrative, everything changed with the Neolithic Revolution around 10,000 BC. Humans in several regions independently discovered that they could plant seeds, tend crops, and harvest food in quantities that far exceeded what they could gather in the wild. In the Fertile Crescent, people began cultivating wheat and barley. In China, they domesticated rice and millet. In Mesoamerica, they learned to breed maize from a wild grass that barely resembled the productive crop it would become. Agriculture meant staying in one place. Staying in one place meant building permanent structures. Permanent structures meant accumulating possessions that nomadic peoples couldn't carry. Food surplus meant some people could specialize in crafts rather than food production. Specialization meant social complexity. Social complexity meant hierarchy, administration, record-keeping. By this logic, writing should have developed gradually as an administrative tool, starting with simple marks representing basic concepts, and slowly evolving into systems capable of expressing complex ideas. Mathematics should have begun with counting and basic addition, progressing over generations to multiplication, division, fractions, and eventually geometry and astronomy. Architecture should have evolved from simple rectangular huts to more complex structures, as builders learned through trial and error what worked and what collapsed. We should be able to trace this development in the archaeological record, seeing the mistakes and refinements, the dead ends and breakthroughs that characterize any learning process. And in some cases, we can see exactly this pattern. The Ubaid culture, which occupied southern Mesopotamia from approximately 5000 to 4000 BC, shows gradual development typical of societies learning agriculture and settling in permanent villages. Their pottery improves in quality over time. Their buildings slowly become more substantial. Their settlements grow from small clusters of a dozen structures to larger villages with 100 or more inhabitants. Their tools show refinement, as techniques are perfected across generations. This is what normal cultural development looks like, and it's exactly what we should see everywhere if the conventional narrative is correct. But then, around 3200 BC, something happens that breaks the pattern completely. Sumerian civilization doesn't gradually emerge from Ubaid culture through a smooth progression of improvements and innovations. Instead, it appears with a sudden leap in sophistication that leaves archaeologists struggling for explanations. The city of Uruk, which becomes the largest urban center in the world at that time, isn't a slightly bigger Ubaid village with slightly better organization. It's a planned metropolis housing perhaps 80,000 people, with specialized districts for different crafts and trades, monumental temple complexes rising on artificial platforms, and administrative archives containing thousands of tablets recording transactions in a writing system that works efficiently from its first appearance. Leonard Woolley wasn't the only archaeologist to notice this problem. At Uruk, excavations in the 20th century revealed layer after layer of occupation. But the earliest layers that could definitively be called Sumerian already showed urban planning at a scale that should have required generations to develop. The Eanna district, a sacred precinct dedicated to the goddess Inanna, covered over 20 acres and included buildings with sophisticated column systems, limestone foundations transported from quarries 50 miles away, and decorative elements showing artistic traditions that appear fully formed. There's no evidence of architects experimenting with column placement or learning through failure how much weight different configurations could bear. The columns work from the beginning, because whoever designed them already understood the principles of load distribution. The writing system presents an even more acute problem. The earliest cuneiform tablets, dating to approximately 3200 BC, aren't primitive scratches representing simple objects through obvious pictograms. They're part of a complex system that includes phonetic elements, grammatical markers, determinatives that specify how symbols should be read in context, and the ability to express abstract concepts that have no simple visual representation. A tablet from this early period might record not just quantities of grain, which could be done with simple tally marks, but the terms of a loan agreement, including interest rates, collateral, witnesses, and penalties for default. This requires a writing system sophisticated enough to capture nuance, specify conditions, and make distinctions that simple accounting can't manage. Scholars studying the development of writing systems note that they typically evolve through distinct stages over long periods. First comes the pictographic stage, where symbols represent concrete objects through recognizable images. A drawing of a bull means bull. A drawing of grain means grain. This is followed by the ideographic stage, where symbols begin to represent abstract concepts associated with their original pictographs. The image of a bull might come to mean strength or wealth, not just the animal itself. Then comes the rebus stage, where symbols representing objects that are easy to draw are borrowed to represent similar-sounding words that are harder to depict visually. Finally, systems become truly phonetic, with symbols representing sounds that can be combined to form any word in the language. We can trace this evolution in Egyptian hieroglyphics over many centuries. We can see it in the development of Chinese characters across dynasties. But Sumerian cuneiform appears to skip straight to a late stage of development, emerging with phonetic elements already integrated into a system that works efficiently for a wide range of purposes. The earliest tablets show the kind of sophistication that should come after generations of scribes have refined and standardized the system. Not at the moment of its invention. It's as if the Sumerians received a complete instruction manual, rather than inventing writing themselves. The mathematics is equally puzzling. The Sumerian base 60 system appears fully formed in the earliest tablets, already being used for complex calculations involving multiplication, division, and fractions. This isn't a natural counting system that would evolve from people counting on their fingers, which gives you base 10, or counting finger segments, which gives you base 12. Base 60 is too sophisticated, too well-suited for specific purposes like astronomical calculations and geometric measurements, to have emerged spontaneously from everyday counting practices. Someone chose it deliberately because they understood its advantages, and those advantages only become apparent when you're doing advanced mathematics. A tablet housed in the Yale Babylonian collection and catalogued as YBC 7289 demonstrates calculations of square roots using methods that wouldn't be formally codified in Western mathematics until the ancient Greeks developed geometric algebra. The tablet shows a square with its diagonals drawn, and along one side are numbers representing the square root of 2, calculated to 6 decimal places of accuracy. This level of precision requires not just the concept of irrational numbers, but computational techniques sophisticated enough to approximate them accurately. The Sumerians were doing this in 3200 BC, more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born, and 2,000 years before Euclid wrote his Elements. Leonard Woolley spent the rest of his life wrestling with what he found at Ur. His published reports are models of careful archaeological description, meticulously documenting every wall, every artifact, every stratigraphic layer. But his personal correspondence and diary entries reveal a man struggling to reconcile evidence with theory. In a letter to a colleague at the British Museum, written in 1924, he admits that the sophistication at the lowest levels of occupation troubles him. He'd expected to find proof of gradual development, evidence that would support the prevailing theories about how civilizations emerge from simpler societies. Instead, he found what looked like a complete transplant of urban civilization into a region that supposedly had nothing before but agricultural villages. Other archaeologists working at different Sumerian sites reported similar findings. At Nippur, excavations revealed a religious complex that served as a center of learning, with schools for training scribes, libraries containing thousands of tablets, and astronomical observatories for tracking celestial movements. The earliest levels of this complex, dating to the same period as Woolley's findings at Ur, already showed institutional organization on a scale that suggested long-established traditions. The curriculum for training scribes was standardized, with students copying the same practice texts in the same sequence, learning the same mathematical tables, studying the same literary works. This standardization implies a central authority that had already determined what knowledge was essential and how it should be transmitted. But there's no evidence of the gradual development of that curriculum. It appears complete, suggesting it was based on earlier models that haven't survived in the archaeological record. Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent decades in the 20th century translating Sumerian tablets and became one of the foremost experts on Sumerian literature and culture, described the writing system as surgically precise from its earliest examples. He noted that the grammar was complete, the vocabulary extensive, and the ability to record everything from grain inventories to philosophical dialogues present from the beginning. In his book, History Begins at Sumer, Kramer catalogs dozens of firsts attributed to Sumerian civilization, from the first schools to the first legal codes to the first literary debates. But he also notes repeatedly that these firsts don't show the experimentation and refinement we'd expect from genuine innovations. They appear as if fully conceived, implemented according to a plan, rather than discovered through trial and error. You're back in that trench with Woolley, the sun now touching the horizon, painting the excavation walls in shades of amber and copper. The workers have stopped for the day, and in the silence that follows their departure, you can almost hear the whisper of the city that once stood here, the voices of scribes and merchants and priests who walked these streets when they were new, who knew things we've forgotten, who preserved knowledge we're only now beginning to suspect they possessed. Maybe the problem isn't with the evidence. Maybe the problem is with our assumptions about how civilizations begin. We've built an entire framework of understanding on the belief that humans progress linearly, from simple to complex, that each generation builds on the work of those before in a steady climb upward. But what if that's not how it works? What if human history is cyclical, with periods of advancement followed by collapse, dark ages where knowledge is lost, and then reconstruction efforts where survivors implement what they managed to preserve? If Sumer was rebuilding rather than inventing, if the Sumerians were working from inherited knowledge rather than starting from zero, then the sudden sophistication makes perfect sense. The writing system appears complete because it's based on an earlier system that was refined over generations we can't see. The mathematics appears advanced because it was preserved from a time when those calculations were necessary for purposes we can only guess at. The architecture appears confident because it follows principles that were already proven, already tested, already known to work. This interpretation requires accepting something uncomfortable. It means we're not the first. It means humans have reached this level of capability before, built impressive civilizations before, achieved knowledge and sophistication that rivals our own before. And if they built all that and then lost it, if catastrophe can erase even advanced civilizations so completely that their successors barely remember they existed, then what does that say about our own fragility? What does it say about the permanence of progress we take for granted? But here's the question that should keep you awake tonight, the question that follows you out of this excavation and into the present day. If Sumer was rebuilding, what was it rebuilding from? What came before the cities, before the tablets, before the sophistication that appears without precursors? Where did the knowledge come from? And what happened to the civilization that created it? The answer to that question exists, carved into stone in a place that shouldn't exist according to conventional timelines. It sits on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, buried deliberately around 8000 BC, by people who understood that preservation sometimes means hiding knowledge where destruction can't reach it. It's called Gobekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill, and it changes everything we thought we knew about when humans became capable of monumental architecture, complex organization, and astronomical observation. Are you ready to go back 6,000 years before Sumer, to a time when the world was just emerging from a catastrophe that lasted over 1,000 years, to see the first monument built by the survivors who would eventually pass their knowledge down through generations until it reached the river valleys of Mesopotamia? Because we're about to travel to a construction site where people who supposedly lived as simple hunter-gatherers somehow quarried 20-ton blocks of limestone, transported them across difficult terrain, carved them with intricate designs, and erected them in circles aligned to celestial events with precision that required systematic observation and mathematical understanding. The stones are still there. They've been waiting for 12,000 years for someone to understand what they represent. Not the beginning of civilization, but the first backup system, the first attempt by people who had watched their world end to ensure that knowledge would survive even if they didn't, even if catastrophe came again, even if everything they built was erased and future generations had to start over. Let's go meet the survivors and see what they were trying to save. The path descends from Sumer into deeper time, and the silence there has more to say than any of the tablets pressed in clay. Chapter 2. Göbekli Tepe, the first monument after the flood. You're standing on a hillside in southeastern Turkey, 9,600 years before the birth of Christ. The Younger Dryas has just ended. For 1,300 years, the world was locked in an ice age that returned without warning, that killed the megafauna, that turned grasslands into tundra, that made survival a daily battle against cold and hunger and the slow dissolution of everything your ancestors had built. But now the ice is retreating. The temperature is rising. Water flows again in riverbeds that were frozen for longer than any living person can remember. The earth is breathing, and with that breath comes possibility, comes hope, comes the desperate urgency to make sure this never happens again, to preserve what was almost lost, to build something that will outlast the next catastrophe, because you know, deep in your bones, that catastrophes come. Around you on this hill, limestone bedrock breaks through the soil. Your people chose this place carefully. It's high enough to avoid floods. It's visible from a distance, a landmark that travelers can navigate by. The stone beneath your feet is workable, soft enough to carve, but hard enough to endure. You're not alone here. Hundreds of others have gathered, drawn from villages scattered across the region, united by a purpose that transcends daily survival. You've come to build something permanent, something that will speak across time to people you'll never meet, that will preserve knowledge even if language changes, even if your culture dissolves, even if the world ends again and survivors have to piece together meaning from whatever fragments remain. Your hands are rough from labor, scarred from accidents with stone tools that aren't quite adequate for what you're attempting. You're working with limestone blocks that weigh more than 20 tons, quarrying them from bedrock using techniques that require coordination, planning, and an understanding of leverage and stress points that shouldn't exist in a society of hunter-gatherers. Because that's what archaeologists will call you thousands of years from now when they discover what you're building. They'll call you simple, primitive. People who lived in small bands following game animals, who shouldn't have the organizational capacity or the technical knowledge to create what's rising on this hilltop. But you're not simple. You're the inheritors of knowledge that survived the long cold. Your grandparents told you stories that their grandparents told them. Stories about cities that drowned when the ice melted. About knowledge that was lost when the world changed. About the importance of preservation, of redundancy, of building things that can't be destroyed by fire or flood, or the slow erosion of forgetting. You're not inventing architecture, you're implementing it. You're not discovering astronomical alignments, you're recreating them. You're not the beginning of something. You're the continuation of something that was almost ended. And every stone you raise is an act of defiance against the catastrophe that tried to erase your heritage. The sun sets behind the western hills, and in the fading light you see the first pillar standing complete, 18 feet tall, carved with images that mean something, that represent knowledge your children will need, that encode information in stone because stone doesn't burn, doesn't rot, doesn't depend on unbroken chains of oral transmission. Tomorrow you'll raise another, and another. And when this circle is complete, you'll build more. Because one monument might be found, might be destroyed, might fail to preserve what matters. But multiple monuments, built with knowledge encoded in their alignments and their carvings, and their very existence, those might survive. Those might speak to the future, even when your language is dead and your cities are dust. In 1963, an archaeological survey team from Istanbul University walked across a hillside in southeastern Turkey near the city of Şanlıurfa. They were documenting ancient sites in the region, making notes about anything that might warrant future excavation. The hill, called Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill in Turkish, showed some promise. There were limestone fragments scattered on the surface, some of them worked by human hands, suggesting that people had quarried stone here at some point in the past. The surveyors made their notes and moved on. The site was catalogued as a medieval cemetery. Nothing particularly exciting, not worth prioritizing given the hundreds of other sites competing for limited excavation resources. The limestone fragments sat on that hillside for another 30 years, weathering under sun and rain, waiting. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was reviewing old survey reports, looking for sites that might have been misidentified or underestimated. Something about the Gobekli Tepe report caught his attention. Medieval cemeteries don't usually require quarrying operations. The presence of worked limestone suggested something more substantial might be buried beneath the accumulated soil. Schmidt decided to take a look. What he found changed archaeology. Beneath a few feet of soil, massive T-shaped pillars lay buried, arranged in circles, carved with intricate reliefs showing animals that hadn't lived in the region for thousands of years. Schmidt recognized immediately that this wasn't medieval. This wasn't Roman. This wasn't even Bronze Age. The style, the technique, the subject matter all pointed to something far older. He collected samples for radiocarbon dating and waited for results that would either confirm his suspicion or prove him wrong. The dates came back. 9,600 BC. The earliest phase of construction at Gobekli Tepe predates pottery, predates agriculture, predates everything archaeologists had believed was necessary for monumental architecture. This was supposed to be the era of small hunter-gatherer bands, people living in temporary shelters, following game, surviving season to season without the surplus resources or organizational capacity to undertake major construction projects. But here were pillars weighing up to 20 tons, quarried from bedrock, transported across the hillside, erected in precise circles, and carved with skill that demonstrated artistic traditions already mature, already refined, already following established conventions. Schmidt spent the rest of his life excavating Göbekli Tepe, and when he died in 2014, less than 5% of the site had been uncovered. Ground-penetrating radar suggests there are at least 20 more stone circles buried beneath the hill, some of them potentially larger and more elaborate than anything yet revealed. Each excavation season brings new discoveries that push the boundaries of what was supposed to be possible in the 10th millennium BC. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe aren't randomly placed. They're arranged in circles with a consistent orientation, and that orientation relates to celestial events observable from this latitude. The main axis of enclosure D, one of the largest circular structures, aligns with the summer solstice sunset. On the longest day of the year, the sun sets directly in line with the space between two central pillars, creating a sight line that would have been unmistakable to anyone standing in the center of the enclosure. This isn't an accident. Achieving this alignment requires systematic observation of the sun's position over at least a full year, marking the points where it rises and sets on the solstices, calculating the angles, and then positioning massive stones with precision that allows for very little error. Other structures at the site show alignments to different celestial events. Some point to the rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, which in this era rose heliacally in early summer, signaling the approach of the hot season. Some researchers have identified possible alignments to the Pleiades, a star cluster visible to the naked eye that was important in many ancient calendars. The archaeological evidence suggests that whoever built Göbekli Tepe had not just casual knowledge of the sky, but systematic astronomical understanding, the kind that comes from generations of careful observation and record-keeping. This presents a problem. Tracking astronomical cycles across years and decades requires a stable base of operations, a reason to stay in one place and watch the sky night after night, and some method of recording what you see so that patterns can be identified across time spans longer than individual memory. The conventional narrative says this kind of astronomy develops with agriculture, when settled farming communities have both the stability and the need to track seasons for planting and harvest. But Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture by at least 1,000 years. The people who built it were supposedly mobile hunter-gatherers who had no reason to care about celestial alignments and no method of preserving astronomical knowledge across generations. Unless they did have a method, unless they had a reason, unless the astronomical alignments at Göbekli Tepe aren't discoveries made by the builders, but reproductions of knowledge that already existed, knowledge that needed to be preserved in permanent form because the people who held it had learned through bitter experience that catastrophe can erase even sophisticated civilizations if knowledge is stored only in perishable forms like human memory or organic materials. And then there's the burial. Around 8000 BC, approximately 1600 years after the earliest construction at Göbekli Tepe, someone made a decision to end the site's use. They didn't simply abandon it, allowing weather and time to slowly erode the structures. They filled it in, deliberately, bringing hundreds of cubic meters of soil and stone to completely cover the pillars, creating an artificial hill that would protect the carved limestone from the elements. This wasn't destruction. This was preservation through concealment. Why would you bury something you'd worked so hard to create? Why invest enormous resources in construction only to hide it from view? The answer that makes sense is the same one that explains the astronomical alignments and the sophisticated engineering, and the sudden appearance of capabilities that shouldn't exist in this time period. The builders of Gobekli Tepe were preserving knowledge for a future that might need it. And when they'd accomplished that goal, when the knowledge was safely encoded in stone that would last millennia, they'd protected it the only way they knew how. They buried it, deep enough that accidental discovery was unlikely, but shallow enough that deliberate excavation would reveal it. They created a time capsule, a backup system for human knowledge. And then they walked away, trusting that someday someone would dig, would find, would understand. To understand why the builders of Gobekli Tepe were so focused on preservation, you need to understand what came immediately before. The Younger Dryas period, named after an alpine flower that thrives in cold climates and whose pollen appears in sediment layers from this era, lasted from approximately 10,900 BC to 9,600 BC. For 1,300 years, the Earth experienced a return to near-glacial conditions after a brief warming period. Temperature dropped dramatically and suddenly. Ice sheets that had been retreating began advancing again. Sea levels that had been rising stabilized, and in some regions actually fell, as water was locked up in expanding glaciers. The cause of the Younger Dryas is still debated, but recent evidence suggests it may have been triggered by the impact of a fragmented comet or asteroid that exploded in the atmosphere over North America, causing widespread fires and injecting enough particulate matter into the upper atmosphere to block sunlight and initiate rapid cooling. The impact hypothesis is supported by the presence of a layer of sediment from this period containing elevated levels of iridium, microscopic diamonds formed under high pressure and temperature, and spherules of melted rock, all of which are consistent with an extraterrestrial impact event. Whatever the cause, the effects were catastrophic for human populations. Plant communities shifted as cold-adapted species moved south and temperate species died out. The megafauna that human hunters depended on faced starvation as their food sources disappeared. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and dozens of other large animal species went extinct during or immediately after the Younger Dryas, unable to adapt quickly enough to the changing conditions. Human populations that had been growing and spreading across hospitable landscapes suddenly found themselves struggling to survive in a world that had turned hostile. Any civilization that existed during the peak of human development before the Younger Dryas would have faced complete collapse. Coastal settlements would have been abandoned, as dropping temperatures and advancing ice made northern regions uninhabitable. Agricultural systems, if they existed, would have failed, as growing seasons shortened and crops died in unexpected frosts. Trade networks would have broken down as communities focused on immediate survival, rather than long-distance exchange. Knowledge that existed in perishable forms, written on organic materials or preserved only in human memory, would have been lost as populations declined and the transmission of information across generations became uncertain. The people who survived would have been those living in regions that remained marginally habitable, in highlands that weren't covered by ice, in areas where wild game still existed and could be hunted. These survivors would have carried fragments of knowledge from before the catastrophe, stories and skills and understanding that they tried desperately to preserve, even as the mechanisms for preservation collapsed around them. And when the Younger Dryas finally ended around 9,600 BC, when the climate stabilized and the Earth became habitable again, those survivors would have faced a choice about what to do with the knowledge they'd managed to keep alive through the long cold. You're back on that hillside, but now you're in the present, standing among excavated pillars that have emerged from their protective burial after 12,000 years. The carvings are still sharp, the stone is intact, the astronomical alignments still work, still point to the same celestial events they were designed to mark. The preservation worked, the knowledge survived. But not because of luck, not because of accident, because people who had experienced catastrophic loss made deliberate choices about how to ensure that knowledge would outlast them. Göbekli Tepe wasn't the beginning of civilization. It was the first successful backup system, created after civilization almost ended. The hunters who supposedly built this monument weren't primitive people, slowly inventing architecture. They were the descendants of survivors who remembered enough about what was lost to know it needed to be preserved, who understood that oral tradition alone is too fragile, too dependent on unbroken chains of transmission, too vulnerable to the disruptions that catastrophe brings. They chose stone because stone outlasts everything. They chose astronomical alignments because the stars don't change, because anyone in the future, with the patience to observe, can rediscover what the alignments mean. They encoded knowledge in a form designed to survive the fall of languages, the collapse of cultures, the complete erasure of their civilization. And then they buried it. Not to hide it, but to protect it, because they understood something we've forgotten in our confidence about the permanence of progress. They understood that knowledge is always one catastrophe away from extinction, that everything we know and everything we've built can be lost if we don't actively work to preserve it across timescales longer than our individual lives, longer than our civilizations, long enough to bridge the gaps that disasters create. But Göbekli Tepe wasn't alone. Across the planet, separated by oceans that conventional history says couldn't be crossed, other stones were rising. Same techniques, same purposes, same precision. And that pattern suggests something that archaeology is only beginning to acknowledge. Before the flood, before the Younger Dryas erased the old world, there was connection. There was knowledge. There was a civilization that we're only now starting to see. Are you beginning to see the pattern? Because what we're looking at isn't a single isolated monument built by one unusually ambitious group of hunter-gatherers. We're looking at evidence of a global response to global catastrophe. A coordinated effort by survivors scattered across vast distances to preserve knowledge in the most permanent form they could create. The megaliths rising from Turkey to England, from Peru to Japan. They aren't independent inventions. They're variations on a theme, implementation of a shared understanding about how to build things that last, about how to encode information in stone, and alignment and proportion. Let's follow this thread across the world. Let's trace the connections that shouldn't exist between cultures that never met. Let's stand at Stonehenge on the summer solstice and watch the sun rise over the heel stone in perfect alignment. Then travel to Sacsayhuaman in Peru and see stones fitted with the same impossible precision, serving the same astronomical function. Let's look at the pattern of megalithic construction that spans the globe, all of it dating to the period after the Younger Dryas. all of it showing capabilities that exceed what should be possible for the cultures that supposedly built these monuments. Because the stones are still speaking. They're telling us about knowledge that survived catastrophe, about human capability that existed before the flood, about connections that predate the civilizations we acknowledge. The question is whether we're ready to listen, ready to accept what the evidence shows, even when it contradicts everything we thought we knew about human history and the timeline of our development. The next stop on this journey crosses oceans and spans continents. The megalithic network is waiting, and it has more to say. Chung 3, the global megalithic network. You're watching the sun rise on the summer solstice at Stonehenge, standing among the massive sarsen stones that have marked this moment for over 4,000 years. The air is cold, mist rising from the grassland around you. And in the growing light, you can see dozens of other people gathered here, all waiting for the same thing. As the sun breaks the horizon, it appears precisely framed by the heelstone, a single monolith standing apart from the main circle, positioned with such accuracy that the alignment works year after year, century after century, despite the slow wobble of Earth's axis that shifts celestial positions over millennia. The first ray of sunlight shoots through the gap, illuminating the center of the stone circle, and for a moment you understand viscerally why ancient people cared about this, why they invested enormous resources in marking this exact instant when the northern hemisphere tilts closest to the sun. Now you're standing 6,000 miles southwest, high in the Andes Mountains of Peru, at a place called Sacsayhuaman, overlooking the city of Cusco. The air is thin here, over 11,000 feet above sea level, and the stones around you are even more massive than those at Stonehenge. Some weigh over 200 tons. They're fitted together with joints so precise that you can't slide a knife blade between them, cut at angles that interlock in 3 dimensions, designed to flex during earthquakes without collapsing. And like Stonehenge, this site marks celestial events. The walls align with the June solstice, the December solstice, the equinoxes. Different stones, different hemisphere, different culture, separated by an ocean that conventional history insists was an impossible barrier to ancient peoples. Yet somehow, impossibly, these two civilizations built the same thing, for the same purpose, with the same sophisticated understanding of astronomy and engineering. You've never traveled between these places. The people who built Stonehenge around 2500 BC had no contact with the people who built Sacsayhuaman around 1400 AD. They spoke different languages. They worshipped different gods. They developed in complete isolation according to every archaeological model. There should be no similarity beyond the basic human impulse to stack stones. And yet here you are, looking at sites separated by vast distance and vast time, seeing the same precision, the same astronomical alignments, the same choice to use stones far larger than necessary, as if size itself was important, as if permanence mattered more than efficiency. The question forms in your mind like condensation on cold stone. How? How did cultures that never communicated build the same monuments, encode the same knowledge, make the same choices about what deserved to be preserved? The conventional answer is independent invention, the idea that humans everywhere naturally develop similar solutions to similar problems. But that answer requires ignoring the specifics. These aren't just big stones. They're specific configurations aligned to specific celestial events, using specific engineering techniques that shouldn't exist in cultures supposedly working without metal tools, without mathematics, without the accumulated knowledge that comes from literate civilizations learning from their predecessors. Unless that accumulated knowledge did exist. Unless it was shared. Unless both of these monuments and dozens more scattered across the globe were built by people working from the same inherited blueprint, implementing knowledge that survived from before the catastrophe that reset human civilization. Stonehenge sits on Salisbury Plain in southern England, constructed in multiple phases between 3100 and 1600 BC. The site evolved over time, but its core purpose remained constant across all modifications. It's an astronomical observatory, a calendar in stone that marks the solstices and equinoxes with precision that requires not just observation, but calculation. The builders transported bluestones weighing up to 4 tons from quarries in Wales, over 150 miles away. Then erected sarsen stones weighing up to 30 tons, some of them topped with horizontal lintels held in place by mortise and tenon joints, a woodworking technique implemented in stone. The engineering is sophisticated. The lintels are curved on their inner faces to follow the circle, carved with protruding tenons that fit into holes carved in the uprights, creating a stable structure that has survived 4 millennia of weather and neglect. Why build it this way? If the goal was simply to mark the solstice, you could drive wooden posts into the ground, create sight lines without moving massive stones across mountains and rivers. But wood rots. Wood burns. Wood can be destroyed by accident or malice, and within a few generations, even a carefully maintained timber structure needs replacement. Stone lasts. Stone survives fire and flood, and the slow erosion of centuries. The choice to use massive stones, despite the enormous effort required, suggests that permanence was the priority. That whoever commissioned this construction understood they were building for a time span far beyond their own lives. Sacsayhuaman demonstrates the same priorities on an even more ambitious scale. The walls contain stones weighing over 200 tons, quarried from sites miles away, transported uphill to an elevation over 11,000 feet, then shaped and fitted with tolerances that modern stonemasons struggled to achieve even with power tools. The joints between stones aren't simple flat surfaces. They're complex, three-dimensional puzzles, with each stone shaped to interlock with its neighbors in multiple directions simultaneously. This technique, called polygonal masonry, creates walls that can flex during seismic activity without collapsing, distributing stress across multiple stones rather than concentrating it at vulnerable joints. The Spanish conquistadors who first saw Sacsayhuaman in the 16th century couldn't believe humans had built it. They attributed the construction to demons or giants, anything but the Inca civilization they'd just conquered, because the engineering seemed impossible for people working with stone tools and no written mathematical tradition. Modern engineers analyzing the site have confirmed that building it would be extraordinarily difficult, even with contemporary equipment. Moving 200-ton stones requires cranes, heavy machinery, precisely engineered roads capable of bearing enormous loads. Yet archaeological evidence shows that the stones were shaped using harder stones as tools, pounding and grinding rather than cutting. And still the surfaces are smooth, the angles precise, the fits so tight that the walls have survived centuries of earthquakes that destroyed constructions built with mortar and steel. The pattern extends beyond these 2 famous sites, and in ways that conventional archaeology struggles to explain. At Newgrange in Ireland, a passage tomb built around 3000 BC, older than Stonehenge and the Great Pyramid, features a roof box precisely positioned so that sunrise on the winter solstice sends a beam of light down the 60-foot passage to illuminate the inner chamber for exactly 17 minutes. The alignment has remained accurate for 5,000 years, despite the slow precession of Earth's axis. Building this required not just observing the solstice, but calculating the exact angle needed for the roof box, predicting where the sun would rise decades or centuries into the future, and constructing the passage with precision that allows no significant deviation. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built around 2560 BC, encodes mathematical constants that ancient Egyptians supposedly didn't know. The ratio of the pyramid's perimeter to its height is 2 pi, the same ratio as a circle's circumference to its radius. The pyramid's base is level to within less than 1 inch across its 750-foot span. Its sides are aligned to true north, with accuracy better than 1/10 of 1 degree. Its dimensions, when measured in ancient Egyptian royal cubits, produce numbers that relate to astronomical cycles, the size of the Earth, and mathematical constants that wouldn't be formally described until thousands of years after the pyramid was built. Across the Atlantic in South America, the Nazca lines cover hundreds of square miles of Peruvian desert. Geometric patterns and animal figures so large they can only be fully appreciated from the air. Created between 500 BC and 500 AD, the lines include perfectly straight paths extending for miles across varied terrain, curves that maintain constant radii, and geometric figures with proportions that demonstrate mathematical understanding. Some lines align to solstice sunrises, some point to water sources in the mountains. The precision required to create these lines without aerial perspective remains unexplained. But here's what changes everything. In 2019, a team of archaeologists working with satellite imaging technology discovered something that had been hidden in plain sight for 12,000 years. When you map the locations of major megalithic sites across the globe, Stonehenge, Giza, Göbekli Tepe, Sacsayhuaman, Newgrange, Angkor Wat, Easter Island, Teotihuacan. When you plot their coordinates on a map showing coastlines, not as they are today, but as they were 15,000 years ago, before the ice melted and sea levels rose, a pattern emerges that shouldn't exist. The sites form a network, not a random scattering, but a precise geometric arrangement where the distances between sites follow mathematical ratios, where sightlines connect monuments separated by thousands of miles, where the angles formed by connecting 3 or more sites produce the same geometric constants encoded in the Great Pyramid. It's not a constellation pattern or a coincidence of geography. It's a deliberate grid, a navigation system, waypoints positioned according to a master plan that required understanding not just local terrain, but global geography. And here's the part that keeps you awake at night. When you overlay this network onto the ancient coastline map, nearly every major intersection point, every place where multiple sightlines converge, sits beneath the ocean. The grid wasn't built on empty land. It was built around cities, population centers, places that mattered enough to serve as anchor points for a global positioning system. Cities that drowned when the ice melted. Cities we've never found because we've been looking on land when we should have been looking 300 feet underwater, out on the continental shelves where millions lived before the flood. The megalithic monuments aren't just observatories or temples or tombs. They're the high ground markers of a navigation system designed to survive the catastrophe. The survivors built them on peaks and plateaus that would remain above water, encoding knowledge about where the old world had been, preserving coordinates so that future generations could find their way back to what was lost. The stones are speaking, pointing to locations we haven't excavated because they're underwater, telling us exactly where to look if we're finally willing to listen. The engineering similarities across these sites go beyond general principles to specific techniques that suggest shared knowledge or common origin. Polygonal masonry, the interlocking stone-fitting method used at Sacsayhuaman, appears at sites across South America, and also shows up in ancient constructions in Egypt, Greece, and Italy. The joints aren't simple mortar and stone stacking, but three-dimensional puzzles requiring each stone to be custom carved to fit its specific position. This technique takes far more time and skill than rectangular blocks with flat joints, yet it appears repeatedly across cultures that supposedly had no contact. At Teotihuacan in Mexico, a city that reached its peak around 500 AD, the layout follows a precise geometric plan, with buildings positioned according to mathematical relationships and astronomical alignments. The Pyramid of the Sun sits at a latitude where the sun passes directly overhead twice per year, and the entire city's orientation is offset exactly 15½ degrees from true north, an angle that aligns the main avenue with the setting of the Pleiades star cluster on the day it made its first annual appearance before dawn. This alignment required long-term astronomical observation and the mathematical ability to translate celestial positions into architectural orientations. In Japan, submerged beneath the waters off Yonaguni Island, lies a stone structure that appears to be a step pyramid with terraces, right angles, and what look like carved channels and geometric patterns. Discovered in 1986, the Yonaguni monument has been dated by geologists to a period when sea levels were lower, which places its construction during or before the end of the last ice age. If it's artificial, then it represents monumental architecture created when conventional history says humans were still hunter-gatherers. These aren't simple achievements that any culture might stumble upon through trial and error. They're demonstrations of sophisticated knowledge implemented by people who understood geometry, astronomy, and engineering at levels that required either impossibly long periods of independent development or inheritance from predecessors who had already perfected these techniques. The conventional timeline allows for gradual development at some sites, but not at places like Göbekli Tepe or Yonaguni, where the sophistication appears thousands of years before it should be possible. The second option, inherited knowledge from an earlier civilization, explains all the sites consistently. But it requires accepting that human history includes a chapter we've forgotten. A global culture that existed before the flood, that built cities, now drowned beneath 300 feet of water, that left only the high ground markers as evidence of what once was. You're standing in the museum now, walking through exhibits that display artifacts from these various sites. The placards describe independent invention, parallel development, the natural human tendency to stack stones and watch the sky. The narrative is comfortable, requiring no dramatic revisions to establish timelines. But you're looking at photographs showing the same engineering solutions implemented across impossible distances, the same astronomical knowledge encoded by cultures that supposedly never communicated, the same choice to build with stones so massive that their transportation remains mysterious even with modern equipment. The coincidence explanation is wearing thin. If a global civilization existed before the Younger Dryas, if knowledge spread across connected populations that the catastrophe then separated and isolated, then the megalithic network makes perfect sense. The survivors scattered to different regions, carrying knowledge they couldn't fully implement immediately because they lacked the population, the resources, the stability. But they preserved what they knew through oral tradition, teaching their children and grandchildren, keeping the knowledge alive through the dark ages that followed catastrophe. When populations finally recovered enough to support monumental construction projects, When stability returned and resources accumulated, those scattered groups implemented what they'd preserved. They built astronomical observatories because that knowledge had survived. They used polygonal masonry because those techniques had been passed down. They created structures aligned to celestial events because understanding the sky had proven essential for survival. But more than that, they built a map, a network of stone waypoints, positioned according to a master plan that encoded the locations of the drowned cities, the lost world beneath the waves. The stones weren't just marking celestial events, they were marking coordinates, preserving geographic knowledge so that future generations with the technology to explore underwater would know exactly where to look. The megalithic builders understood that their immediate descendants might not have the capability to reach the flooded cities, but they built the system anyway, trusting that someday someone would develop the technology necessary to follow the map they'd created in stone. The survivors were thinking in deep time, building for a future they'd never see, encoding knowledge that would outlast empires and languages, and the complete erasure of their own civilization. And the fact that we're only now beginning to decode what they built, only now developing the underwater archaeology necessary to explore the sites their monuments point toward, suggests they understood human capability better than we understand it ourselves. They knew we'd eventually figure it out. They just had to make sure the information survived long enough for us to be ready to receive it. But stone monuments and geometric networks weren't their only legacy. The myths speak of other knowledge, technologies that sound like fantasy until you see the physical evidence that survives in museums, dismissed as anomalies, explained away as coincidence. Because accepting what they represent would require acknowledging that ancient peoples possessed capabilities we've assumed were modern inventions. Batteries that generate electrical current 2,000 years before Benjamin Franklin. Metallurgy that produces alloys we can barely replicate with contemporary methods. Texts describing machines and weapons that sound impossible until you read them carefully and realize they're too specific, too detailed, too technically precise to be pure imagination. Let's go to Baghdad, to Delhi, to the clay tablets that describe manufacturing processes verified by modern materials science. Let's examine the evidence that ancient civilizations possessed knowledge of chemistry, physics, and engineering that conventional timelines say they couldn't have developed. Because if the megaliths show shared astronomical and architectural knowledge, if they form a navigation system pointing to drowned cities, then what other knowledge did the survivors preserve? What other technologies did they pass down through generations, who maintained the techniques even when they no longer fully understood the principles behind them? The artifacts are waiting in museum storage, cataloged, but not integrated into the narrative we tell ourselves about human progress. The Baghdad battery still generates current. The Delhi pillar still doesn't rust. The formulas pressed into Sumerian clay still work when modern scientists follow them. The evidence is there, speaking across millennia, waiting for us to finally listen to what it's saying about who we were and what we're capable of becoming, again. Let's see what they left behind. Chapter 4. Ancient Technologies, the Forgotten Science. You're standing in a storage room beneath the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad, 1936. And in your hands is something that shouldn't exist. It's a clay jar, about 5 inches tall, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of vessel that might have held wine or oil or grain 2,000 years ago, when it was buried in a village outside the city. But this jar is different. Inside, fitted carefully into the clay body, sits a copper cylinder. Inside that cylinder, an iron rod runs down the center, held in place by an asphalt seal at the top. The rod doesn't touch the copper. There's a deliberate gap, a space maintained with precision that suggests purpose rather than accident. Your name is Wilhelm Koenig, and you're a German archaeologist who has spent years studying artifacts from ancient Mesopotamia. You've seen thousands of clay vessels, examined countless examples of ancient metalwork, documented the ingenuity of peoples who lived millennia ago. But this object stops you cold, because you recognize what you're holding. The configuration is unmistakable. Copper cylinder, iron rod, asphalt insulator, clay container designed to hold liquid. This is a galvanic cell. This is a battery, and it's 2,000 years old. Created centuries before Alessandro Volta would be credited with inventing the first battery in 1799. 2 millennia before humanity supposedly understood that different metals immersed in an acidic solution would generate electrical current. You fill the jar with vinegar, an acidic liquid that would have been readily available in ancient Mesopotamia. The copper begins to react. The iron oxidizes. A voltmeter connected to the terminals shows a reading, 0.5 volts. Not much by modern standards, but unmistakable. Undeniable electrical current flowing from a device constructed before the birth of Christ, before the Roman Empire, before anyone was supposed to understand electrochemistry or the principles that govern how batteries function. You write a report describing your findings. You document the construction, photograph the components, describe the electrical output. The jar becomes known as the Baghdad battery, and it should change everything archaeologists believe about ancient technological knowledge. But it doesn't, because accepting that ancient Mesopotamians understood electrochemistry requires explaining how they acquired that knowledge, and the conventional timeline offers no satisfactory answer. So the jar sits in museum storage, documented, but not integrated into the narrative, an anomaly that doesn't fit, and therefore gets quietly ignored by mainstream archaeology, while generating endless debate among researchers willing to question whether the timeline we've been taught is actually correct. Around you in this storage room are thousands of other artifacts, most of them catalogued but never fully studied, waiting for someone to recognize what they represent. Clay tablets describing metallurgical processes, tools that show machining marks inconsistent with the bronze implements supposedly available to their creators, evidence of chemical knowledge, astronomical understanding, engineering principles that appear suddenly in the historical record without the developmental precursors that gradual invention would require. The Baghdad battery isn't an isolated anomaly. It's part of a pattern, and that pattern suggests that the knowledge didn't develop gradually from ignorance to understanding. It was inherited from earlier peoples who had already done the developmental work, who had already discovered these principles through centuries of experimentation, who passed that knowledge forward through the catastrophe that almost erased it. The Baghdad battery wasn't unique. Wilhelm Koenig discovered several similar jars in the same excavation, all showing the same configuration, all capable of generating electrical current when filled with an acidic solution. The site where they were found, Kujut Rabu near Baghdad, dates to the Parthian period, approximately 200 BC to 200 AD. Archaeological context suggests the jars were deliberately buried, possibly hidden during a time of conflict, preserved by accident when whoever concealed them never returned to retrieve them. Modern researchers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the British Museum have constructed exact replicas based on Koenig's documentation. The replicas work.
fill them with vinegar, wine, or any acidic fruit juice,
and they generate between half a volt and 1 volt of electrical current. Connect several in series, and the voltage increases proportionally, demonstrating that ancient craftsmen could have created battery arrays producing enough power for practical applications. But what applications? What did ancient Mesopotamians need electricity for? The most plausible theory involves electroplating, using electrical current to deposit a thin layer of metal onto a conductive surface. Many artifacts from this period show gold or silver plating so thin and uniform that modern jewelers struggle to explain how it was achieved with the hammering and leaf application techniques that ancient peoples supposedly used. But electroplating explains it perfectly. Immerse an object in a solution containing dissolved metal ions. Connect it to the negative terminal of a battery while connecting a piece of the plating metal to the positive terminal, and electrical current will cause metal ions to migrate through the solution and deposit evenly on the object's surface. The technique produces exactly the kind of thin, uniform plating found on ancient artifacts, and it requires understanding of electrochemistry that conventional history doesn't attribute to peoples living 2,000 years ago. Unless they inherited that understanding. Unless knowledge of electricity, batteries, and electroplating survived from an earlier civilization that had discovered these principles through systematic experimentation. The Baghdad battery would then represent not an impossible invention, but a preservation of inherited knowledge, a technique passed down through generations who may not have fully understood the underlying physics, but knew the practical application worked, and carefully maintained the tradition of its construction and use. Koenig's discovery generated controversy that persists today. Mainstream archaeology largely dismisses the batteries as oil lamps or scroll containers, despite the configuration being poorly suited for either purpose. But dismissing them requires ignoring their functionality. They generate electricity. That's not interpretation or speculation. It's measurable, repeatable, demonstrated by multiple independent researchers. The question isn't whether they work as batteries, but whether we're willing to accept the implications of that functionality for our understanding of ancient technological knowledge. In Delhi, India, stands an iron pillar that has defied corrosion for over 1,600 years. Erected around 400 AD during the Gupta Empire, the pillar is over 23 feet tall, weighs more than 6 tons, and shows a purity of iron that approaches 98%. Far exceeding what ancient smelting techniques should have been able to achieve. But the pillar's real mystery isn't its purity, it's its resistance to rust. Delhi experiences monsoon rains, high humidity, and temperature variations that would normally corrode iron within decades. Yet the pillar shows almost no rust, just a thin protective coating that has actually preserved the metal beneath. Metallurgists who have studied the pillar discovered that it contains an unusually high phosphorus content, around 1%, which is about 10 times higher than typical iron. When exposed to moisture and oxygen, this phosphorus reacts to form a crystalline compound called misawite that creates a protective layer preventing deeper oxidation. The effect is similar to the patina that protects bronze, or the oxide layer that forms on aluminum, but it's specific to this particular iron composition and requires precise control during smelting to achieve the right phosphorus levels without creating brittleness or other structural weaknesses. Creating this alloy isn't simple. It requires understanding the relationship between phosphorus content and corrosion resistance, maintaining specific temperatures during smelting, and controlling the cooling process to achieve the desired crystalline structure. Modern materials science can explain why the pillar doesn't rust, but explaining how ancient Indian metallurgists knew to create this specific composition is more difficult. Did they discover it through generations of experimentation, testing different ore sources and smelting techniques, until they found a combination that produced corrosion-resistant iron? Or did they follow instructions inherited from earlier metalworkers who had already done that developmental work? The Sumerians left even more explicit evidence of advanced metallurgical knowledge. Clay tablets from around 2500 BC contain detailed instructions for producing bronze, specifying the ratio of copper to tin, describing furnace temperatures, explaining techniques for removing impurities. One tablet, translated by scholars at the University of Pennsylvania, reads like a modern industrial process manual, breaking the procedure into discrete steps, noting critical control points, warning about common failure modes. This isn't the vague mythological instruction you'd expect from a culture just beginning to work with metal. It's technical documentation, written by people who thoroughly understood what they were doing and wanted to ensure that knowledge was transmitted accurately. Glassmaking provides another example. Mesopotamian texts from the 2nd millennium BC describe glass production with specificity that surprised researchers when they attempted to follow the ancient formulas. The tablets specify ingredients by weight, list required temperatures, describe signs that indicate when each stage of the process is complete. When modern glassmakers followed these instructions exactly, they successfully reproduced ancient glass, confirming that the formulas are accurate and that whoever wrote them possessed sophisticated understanding of chemistry and material science. The library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, dating to the 7th century BC, contained tablets describing the manufacture of colored glass, specifying different mineral additives to produce specific hues. Cobalt compounds for blue, copper compounds for green and red, manganese for purple. The proportions are precise, the results reproducible, and the knowledge required goes well beyond simple trial and error. Someone had systematically investigated how different substances affected glass color, documented their findings, and created reference materials for future artisans. This pattern of precise technical knowledge appearing in early written records suggests that writing wasn't developed to record new discoveries, but to preserve existing knowledge that had previously been transmitted through other means. The earliest tablets don't show people figuring things out. They show people documenting processes that already worked, creating backup copies of information that was too valuable to lose, implementing a preservation system for knowledge that had survived from before the written record began. On the ceiling of the Temple of Hathor at Dendera in Egypt, carved reliefs show objects that Egyptologists describe as lotus flowers with serpents, symbols of creation and divine power. But when you look at these reliefs carefully, noting the details of their construction, another interpretation becomes possible. The objects look remarkably like electric light bulbs, complete with what appears to be a filament inside a glass envelope, cables connecting to a power source, and priests operating what could be switches or controls. The resemblance is so striking that electrical engineers who examine the carvings without knowing their age or context consistently identify them as lighting systems. Christopher Dunn, a precision engineer who has spent decades studying ancient Egyptian technology, points out that if you wanted to draw an electric light bulb using the artistic conventions of ancient Egyptian art, representing it through symbolic elements while maintaining recognizable functionality, you would create something very similar to the Dendera reliefs. The lotus represents the glass envelope. The serpent inside represents the filament. The stem represents the cable. The whole composition can be read as either religious symbolism or technical documentation, depending on what framework you apply. Orthodox Egyptology insists on the religious interpretation, and that may be correct. But it's worth noting that the Dendera temple has several features that are difficult to explain if it was purely ceremonial. The structure has no windows, making interior illumination necessary for the detailed painting work visible along walls and ceilings. Soot marks from oil lamps appear in many Egyptian tombs and temples, staining ceilings black from smoke. But Dendera's ceilings are clean, showing no smoke damage, despite extensive painted decoration that would have required substantial lighting to create. Dunn suggests that if the Egyptians possessed electric lighting, even primitive battery-powered lamps, the absence of soot would make sense. The decorated ceilings could have been painted using light sources that didn't produce smoke. In India, the Vimana Shastra, a Sanskrit text that surfaced in the early 20th century, claiming to be based on much older sources, describes aircraft called Vimanas with extraordinary detail. The text specifies construction materials, including references to mercury-based engines, discusses aerodynamic principles, describes defensive systems, including something that sounds like active camouflage or stealth technology, and provides operating instructions for pilots. When aeronautical engineers at the Indian Institute of Science analyzed the text in 1974, they concluded that the physics described wouldn't work, that the designs wouldn't fly according to modern aerodynamics. But they also noted that the level of technical detail was remarkably sophisticated, far beyond what they'd expect from pure imagination. The text doesn't read like fantasy. It reads like a technical manual, possibly compiled from fragmentary sources that weren't fully understood by later scribes who copied and preserved the texts. If Vimanas actually existed in some earlier period, and knowledge about them survived in corrupted form through oral tradition before being written down centuries later by people who no longer had direct experience with the technology, the resulting text might look exactly like the Vimana Shastra, mixing accurate technical details with garbled explanations and elements that don't quite work because the transmission chain broke down. You're sitting now in a university library, surrounded by archaeological reports and materials science journals, cross-referencing ancient texts with modern technical analysis. The pattern that emerges is consistent, but troubling for conventional chronology. Advanced knowledge appears in early historical periods without developmental precursors. Technical sophistication shows up in writing systems that supposedly just invented writing. Precise formulas and detailed instructions appear in tablets from civilizations that supposedly had no scientific method, no experimental tradition, no framework for systematic investigation. The comfortable explanation is that ancient peoples were smarter than we give them credit for, that they discovered these principles through observation and experimentation that left no archaeological trace. And perhaps that's true for some discoveries, but the breadth of knowledge, the precision of formulas, the sophistication of techniques, all appearing in the earliest written records we possess, suggests something different. It suggests documentation rather than discovery. It suggests that the first writers weren't recording new knowledge, but preserving old knowledge, creating backup systems for information that had previously existed in forms more vulnerable to loss. If a technologically advanced civilization existed before the Younger Dryas catastrophe, if that civilization's knowledge was lost when coastal settlements drowned and populations collapsed, then what we're seeing in these ancient texts and artifacts isn't primitive peoples inventing from scratch. We're seeing survivors and their descendants implementing fragments of knowledge that survived through oral tradition. through carefully preserved techniques, through training programs that maintain skills across generations, even when the theoretical understanding behind those skills had been lost. The Baghdad battery works, but did its makers understand electrochemistry? Or just follow a recipe handed down from earlier metal workers? The Delhi pillar resists corrosion, but did its creators understand phosphorus chemistry? Or just know that iron from certain sources produced better results? The bronze formulas are accurate, but did Sumerian metallurgists derive them through experimentation, or inherit them from predecessors who had already done that work? The evidence suggests inheritance rather than invention, preservation rather than discovery, continuation rather than beginning. But if ancient peoples inherited technological knowledge from predecessors who survived global catastrophe, they also inherited something else. They inherited myths. Stories about teachers who came from elsewhere, who brought the arts of civilization, who taught humans agriculture and writing and law. These stories appear across cultures separated by oceans, and like the megalithic monuments and the technical knowledge, they follow patterns that are too consistent to be coincidence. Different names, different languages, different cultural frameworks, but the same narrative core. Wise beings who came from somewhere else, who taught rather than conquered, who were associated with water and serpents and transformation. Let's meet these teachers. Let's examine the myths that describe them, the attributes they share, the knowledge they supposedly imparted. Because when you strip away the supernatural elements, when you read these stories as garbled historical memory rather than pure mythology, a pattern emerges. The teachers weren't gods. They were humans with knowledge. Survivors from high ground who descended to lowlands after catastrophe receded, who taught agricultural peoples how to build cities, how to write, how to organize complex societies. They were remembered as divine because the knowledge gap was so vast, because what they knew seemed miraculous to people who had lost everything. But underneath the mythology, if you're willing to look, there are historical kernels. There are memories of real events, real people, real transmission of knowledge that allowed civilization to restart rather than reinvent everything from zero. Let's see who they were. Chapter 5. The Teachers. Serpent Gods Across Cultures. You're holding a cylinder seal from Eridu, the oldest city in Sumer, dated to approximately 3500 BC. The artifact is small enough to fit in your palm, carved from dark stone with images that wrap around its cylindrical surface. When rolled across soft clay, it leaves an impression, a signature that authenticated documents and marked ownership in the ancient world. But this seal isn't marking property, it's telling a story. The figure carved into the stone wears a long robe. Water flows from his shoulders in stylized streams. At his feet, a serpent coils, its body forming a foundation beneath the standing figure. Around him are symbols representing writing, mathematics, agriculture, the fundamental technologies of civilization. His name, according to the cuneiform inscription that accompanies similar images on clay tablets, is Enki, god of wisdom, keeper of sacred knowledge, teacher of humanity. Now you're standing 8,000 miles west, in the ruins of Teotihuacan, Mexico, looking at a temple wall covered in painted serpents. These aren't simple snake images. They're composite creatures with serpent bodies covered in feathers, combining earth and sky, reptile and bird, creating an impossible hybrid that dominated Mesoamerican religious thought for thousands of years. The name, preserved in later Aztec sources, is Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. According to the myths, Quetzalcoatl came from the east, taught humans how to cultivate maize, how to measure time, how to build cities, how to organize society under law. He brought the calendar, astronomy, writing, all the foundations of civilization. Then he departed, promising to return, leaving behind knowledge that allowed cultures to flourish. These civilizations never met. The distance between Mesopotamia and Mesoamerica is vast, separated by an ocean that conventional history insists was an uncrossable barrier to ancient peoples. They spoke completely different languages. They developed in complete isolation, according to every archaeological model. There should be no connection between a Sumerian god and a Mesoamerican deity beyond the most superficial similarities that might arise from universal human psychology. And yet here you are, looking at two figures separated by 8,000 miles and 2,000 years, seeing the same association. Wisdom, water, serpents, teaching, knowledge brought from elsewhere, the gift of civilization. The question forms with uncomfortable clarity. How do completely isolated cultures develop identical mythological frameworks featuring teacher figures with the same attributes, performing the same functions? The standard answer is archetypal psychology. The idea that certain symbols and narratives emerge naturally in all human cultures because they reflect universal aspects of human consciousness. The serpent represents transformation because snakes shed their skin. Water represents life because all cultures need it. Teacher figures represent cultural memory of wise elders. These explanations work individually, but when you see the same specific combination of attributes appearing across multiple cultures that supposedly never communicated, coincidence becomes less convincing. Unless they weren't isolated. Unless there was contact, connection, shared origin. Unless the teacher figures aren't archetypes, but memories, garbled and mythologized through centuries of retelling, but preserving a historical core. Unless Enki and Quetzalcoatl, and the dozen other serpent teachers who appear in myths around the world, all derive from the same source, the same actual events, the same knowledge transmission that happened when survivors from before the catastrophe taught isolated groups of humans how to restart civilization. In Sumerian mythology, Enki is the god of water, wisdom, and creation. He dwells in the Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth, the source of springs and rivers that make agriculture possible in the desert. But Enki isn't just associated with water. He's the keeper of the me, divine decrees that govern every aspect of civilization, from kingship to art, from warfare to sexual relations. The me aren't abstract moral principles. They're practical knowledge, technologies, social structures, the building blocks of complex society. And Enki controls them, parcels them out to humans through intermediaries, guards them against those who aren't ready to receive them. The myths describe Enki as uniquely sympathetic to humanity. When the other gods decide to destroy humans through flood, Enki warns a righteous man named Ziusudra, instructing him to build a boat, save his family and representatives of all living creatures, survive the deluge, and repopulate the earth afterward. This flood story appears in multiple Mesopotamian sources, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the survivor is called Utnapishtim, and the Atrahasis epic, where the flood is punishment for human noise disturbing the god's rest. But in every version, one god defects from the divine consensus to preserve humanity, and that god is always Enki. The serpent association is consistent. Enki is depicted with serpents coiling at his feet or emerging from his shoulders. The symbol of intertwined serpents, later adopted as the caduceus, representing medicine and healing, appears first in connection with Enki. The meaning is transformation, the shedding of ignorance for knowledge, the boundary between the civilized and the savage. Snakes in Mesopotamian thought aren't inherently evil. They're liminal, existing between realms, possessing knowledge humans lack. Dangerous, but also potentially beneficial if approached correctly. Enki's primary function in mythology is teaching. He doesn't create through divine fiat. He instructs. He shows humans how to build irrigation systems, how to organize labor for large construction projects, how to record information in writing, how to calculate astronomical cycles. The texts describe him demonstrating techniques, explaining principles, transferring knowledge through deliberate instruction rather than miraculous intervention. This pattern, a teacher figure sharing practical knowledge with humans who lack it, repeats across mythological traditions worldwide, with remarkably consistent details despite supposed isolation. If you strip away the supernatural elements, if you read these myths as cultural memory rather than pure fantasy, what remains is a story about knowledge transfer. Someone who possessed advanced understanding taught agricultural peoples how to develop more complex societies. This teaching was remembered as divine because the knowledge gap was so vast, because the teacher came from elsewhere, because the transformation from village to city happened faster than normal cultural development would predict. The mythology preserves the memory of sudden advancement, rapid acquisition of capabilities that normally take generations to develop, and attributes this advancement to external teachers rather than internal discovery. Quetzalcoatl appears throughout Mesoamerican cultures under various names, but with consistent attributes. The Aztecs called him Quetzalcoatl, feathered serpent. The Maya knew him as Kukulkan. The Toltecs identified him with their legendary ruler, Seacatl Topiltzin. Despite different names and time periods, the core narrative remains stable. A wise teacher arrives from the east, brings knowledge of agriculture, astronomy, and law, establishes civilized society, then departs with promises of eventual return. The agricultural connection is specific. Quetzalcoatl is credited with teaching humans how to cultivate maize, the staple crop that supported all major Mesoamerican civilizations. Wild teosinte, the grass from which maize developed, barely resembles modern corn. The domestication process required systematic selective breeding over many generations, choosing plants with larger kernels, more regular rows, improved yield. This should be a gradual process, visible in the archaeological record as farmers slowly improved their crop. But maize appears in Mesoamerica already substantially domesticated, with genetic analysis suggesting the transformation from teosinte to productive maize happened much faster than conventional agricultural development timelines would predict. The myth attributes this to Quetzalcoatl's teaching, and perhaps that's accurate. Perhaps someone with knowledge of selective breeding, someone from a culture that had already developed agriculture, taught techniques that accelerated the domestication process. The calendar knowledge associated with Quetzalcoatl is sophisticated. The Maya calendar system tracks multiple interlocking cycles with precision that requires systematic astronomical observation spanning generations. The Zolkin calendar runs for 260 days, combining cycles of 13 numbers with 20-day names. The Hob calendar tracks 365 days, divided into 18 months of 20 days plus 5 unlucky days. The Long Count tracks days from a mythological creation date in 3114 BC, counting in cycles of increasing magnitude like an odometer. Coordinating these systems requires mathematics and astronomical knowledge that the myths attribute to Quetzalcoatl's instruction. The serpent feather combination is symbolically rich. Serpents represent earth, water, the underworld, the material realm. Feathers represent sky, air, the celestial sphere, the spiritual realm. Combining them creates a figure that bridges categories, that connects earth and heaven, that mediates between human and divine. This liminal quality appears in teacher figures across cultures. They come from elsewhere, from outside the normal social structure, bringing knowledge that transforms those who receive it. The mythology makes them gods, but the functional role is education, knowledge transfer, the preservation and transmission of information. What's particularly striking is how specific the mythology becomes about what Quetzalcoatl taught. Not vague references to bringing civilization, but detailed lists. Agriculture, specifically maize cultivation, calendar systems and astronomical observation, writing, or at least record-keeping through codices, laws and social organization, architecture and urban planning. This isn't the kind of vague mythology that might arise from universal human psychological patterns. This is cultural memory of specific knowledge transmission, preserved through oral tradition, eventually written down in forms that blend history and mythology, but retain enough detail to suggest real events at the core. The pattern extends beyond these two well-known examples. In West Africa, the Dogon people preserve myths about the Nomo, amphibious beings who came from the star system Sirius and taught humans agriculture, social organization, and astronomy. The Dogon claim knowledge of Sirius B, a white dwarf star invisible to the naked eye, not discovered by Western astronomy until 1862. Skeptics argue the Dogon learned about Sirius B from Western anthropologists, but the mythology predates contact, according to early ethnographic studies. The Nomo, like Enki and Quetzalcoatl, are associated with water, with teaching, with knowledge from elsewhere. In India, the Naga are serpent beings who appear throughout Hindu and Buddhist mythology, associated with water, wisdom, and fertility. They guard treasures, both material wealth and esoteric knowledge. They're not purely benevolent or malevolent, but powerful, dangerous if disrespected, but beneficial if approached correctly. Kings and heroes seek Naga blessing. Temples are built at sites associated with Naga worship. The mythology describes them as an ancient race predating current humanity, possessing knowledge that humans can access through proper ritual and respect. Babylonian mythology includes Oannes, a being described by the priest Berosus in the 3rd century BC as appearing during the reign of the first king. Oannes is amphibious, spending days on land teaching humans, but returning to the sea at night. He instructs humans in writing, agriculture, architecture, law,
all the foundations of civilization. The description is remarkably specific. Oannes has a fish-like body, but a human head beneath the fish head, human feet beneath fish tail. An anatomical confusion that might represent misunderstood protective gear or diving equipment garbled through centuries of transmission.
The consistency is striking. Across continents, across cultures that supposedly never communicated, the same figure appears. A teacher, associated with water and serpents, coming from elsewhere, bringing practical knowledge about agriculture, writing, astronomy, social organization. Different names, different languages, different mythological frameworks, but the same functional role. The same knowledge being transmitted. The same transformation from simple to complex society attributed to external instruction rather than internal development. Orthodox anthropology dismisses these similarities as universal archetypes, natural symbols that any human culture might develop independently. But the specificity argues against pure coincidence. These aren't just vague, wise figures. They're knowledge bearers with consistent attributes, teaching consistent technologies. The pattern suggests shared origin, common source, memories of actual knowledge transmission events that were later mythologized when the historical context was lost. But the cultural impact remains strong enough to preserve the stories. Strip away the supernatural elements, and what remains is a historical pattern that makes sense if civilization restarted after catastrophe. Survivors from highland refuges, people who preserved knowledge through the Younger Dryas Dark Age, descending to river valleys when climate stabilized, and teaching agricultural peoples who had lost most of their cultural complexity. These teachers would have seemed godlike to populations struggling with subsistence farming. Their knowledge of writing, mathematics, astronomy, irrigation, urban planning, all the technologies necessary for complex society would have appeared miraculous. The serpent symbolism makes sense as a deliberate teaching tool. Snakes shed their skin, transforming without dying. A perfect metaphor for the transformation from ignorance to knowledge, from simple to complex, from savage to civilized. Water association makes sense because post-catastrophe survivors would have been obsessed with water management, with irrigation, with flood control, with the hydrological knowledge necessary to support agriculture in challenging environments. The teaching function makes sense because knowledge transmission was the primary purpose, the reason survivors sought out isolated populations and invested time in instruction. The myths aren't describing gods. They're describing humans with knowledge, teaching humans without knowledge. But the gap was vast enough, the transformation rapid enough, the impact profound enough, that the teachers were remembered as more than human, elevated through mythological transmission into divine figures. Later cultures worshipped them, built temples to them, created elaborate theologies around them. But at the core, beneath the religious development, there's memory. Memory of contact, memory of instruction, memory of knowledge received rather than discovered, memory of the restart rather than the beginning. You're walking through museum exhibits now, seeing artifacts from Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, West Africa, India, each culture's teacher figure represented in different artistic styles, but serving the same narrative function. The labels describe mythology, religion, cultural beliefs about divine origins. But what if the labels are wrong? What if these aren't myths about gods, but memories of history, garbled through centuries of oral transmission, but preserving real events, real knowledge transfer, real contact between peoples with vastly different levels of technological sophistication. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Teacher figures associated with water, serpents, and transformation, bringing practical knowledge about agriculture, writing, and social organization, remembered across cultures that supposedly developed in complete isolation. The standard explanation requires believing that humans everywhere independently created nearly identical myths, serving nearly identical cultural functions. But the alternative explanation, that these myths preserve memories of actual knowledge transmission events following global catastrophe, requires accepting that human civilization has been here before, that we've reached technological sophistication and then lost it, that survivors from the last collapse taught our ancestors how to rebuild. That's uncomfortable, because it means we're not the first. It means progress isn't guaranteed. It means everything we've built could be lost if we don't actively work to preserve it across catastrophe. The teacher figures understood this. They had experienced loss. They had survived collapse. They knew that knowledge is fragile, that civilization can end, that without deliberate preservation and transmission, everything can be forgotten. So they taught. They encoded knowledge in multiple forms. They created redundancy. They built systems designed to survive even if individual components failed. The Serpent teachers weren't gods. They were humans who understood the cycle, who knew that civilization rises and falls, who chose to break that cycle by ensuring knowledge survived to help the next generation restart, rather than reinvent everything. They are what we need to become if we want to break the cycle ourselves, if we want to ensure that what we know outlasts us, if we want future survivors to rebuild faster than starting from zero. But the Serpent teachers weren't the only pattern connecting supposedly isolated cultures. Symbols appear across the globe that carry identical meanings, represent identical concepts, serve identical functions, despite supposed lack of contact. The tree connecting three realms appears in Sumer, Egypt, India, Mesoamerica, and Scandinavia, with remarkably consistent structure. The spiral marking cycles and transformation appears on megalithic monuments from Ireland to Japan. The rotating cross, representing celestial motion, shows up in cultures separated by oceans and millennia. These aren't vague similarities that might arise from universal psychology. These are specific symbols with specific meanings, implemented with specific artistic conventions. How do completely isolated cultures create identical symbolic systems? The orthodox answer is independent invention, driven by shared human cognitive architecture. But that explanation struggles when the symbols become too specific, too elaborate, too functionally identical across too many cultures. The alternative is that these symbols, like the megalithic monuments and the teacher myths, derive from a common source that predates the cultures we acknowledge. Their inheritance from before the catastrophe, preserved because they encoded essential knowledge, maintained because breaking the transmission chain meant losing information that might prove crucial for survival. Let's trace these symbols. Let's see how the Tree of Life appears in texts from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, with the same three-realm structure. Let's examine spirals carved on stones separated by thousands of miles, all representing the same cyclical concepts. Let's look at the swastika, a symbol so universal it appeared on every inhabited continent before becoming permanently tainted by 20th century atrocity. Because these symbols are speaking, if we're willing to listen, they're telling us about connections that predate recorded history, about knowledge shared before the flood, about human civilization's true depth. Chapter 6. Shared Symbols, the Common Language. You're walking through the British Museum on a Tuesday morning when the crowds are thin, moving from gallery to gallery, crossing continents and millennia with each doorway. In the Mesopotamian wing, you stop before a cylinder seal showing a stylized tree with symmetrical branches reaching upward and downward. Roots and canopy mirror images, 3 distinct levels representing underworld, earth, and heaven. The label dates it to approximately 2500 BC. You photograph it and move on. 2 hours later, you're in the Egyptian galleries, standing before a painted coffin fragment from the Book of the Dead. The image shows a tree growing from water, its trunk rising through the earth realm where humans dwell, its branches reaching toward the sky where gods reside. The artistic style is completely different from the Mesopotamian seal, the cultural context entirely distinct, but the structure is identical. 3 realms, vertical axis, connection between levels. You photograph this too and continue walking. By afternoon, you're examining a bronze artifact from the Indus Valley, a seal showing what archaeologists call the Ashvata tree, the cosmic tree that appears in Vedic texts with roots in heaven and branches growing downward to earth. The mythology describes souls traveling this inverted tree, descending from spiritual realms into material existence. Different hemisphere, different millennium, different civilization, but the same symbolic framework. You photograph it and cross to the American wing. There, among Aztec codices, you find yet another tree, the Maya world tree that connects Xibalba, the underworld, with the earthly plane and the celestial realm above, often depicted with a serpent coiling around its trunk, birds perched in its branches, roots penetrating the watery underworld. The pattern is now undeniable. You're not seeing variations on a vague theme. You're seeing the same specific symbol implemented across cultures separated by impossible distances, preserved in artifacts spanning thousands of years, consistent in structure even when artistic conventions differ completely. You sit on a bench surrounded by human history compressed into museum galleries, your phone full of photographs showing the same image repeated across civilizations that supposedly never communicated. The tree of life, the world tree, the cosmic axis, different names in different languages, but identical function. A vertical connection between realms, a pathway for souls or knowledge or divine power. A representation of cosmic structure that appears so consistently across human cultures that dismissing it as coincidence requires ignoring the specificity. Orthodox anthropology explains this through universal cognitive patterns. Humans everywhere see trees connecting earth and sky, so trees become natural symbols for cosmic structure. But that explanation doesn't account for the details. Why 3 realms specifically? Why the emphasis on bidirectional flow with roots and branches equally important? Why the association with knowledge, transformation, and the boundary between mortal and divine? These aren't just tree images. They're sophisticated cosmological diagrams encoding specific concepts about reality's structure. And they appear already complete in the earliest records we have, suggesting not gradual development, but inheritance, not invention, but preservation. The Sumerian Tree of Life appears on cylinder seals, temple walls, and clay tablets throughout Mesopotamian history. It's typically stylized, with symmetrical branches arranged in precise geometric patterns, often flanked by figures who appear to be tending it or receiving something from it. The tree grows from water, or stands between water sources, connecting the Abzu, the freshwater abyss beneath the earth, with the realm of gods above. It's not just decorative. It represents the structure of reality itself, the connection between different planes of existence, the pathway through which divine knowledge flows to humanity.
Egyptian versions emphasize the tree's role in sustaining both physical and spiritual life. The sycamore tree appears in funerary texts as a source of food and water for souls traveling through the afterlife. The goddess Hathor, or Nut, sometimes appears emerging from the tree, offering sustenance to the deceased. But more abstract versions show the tree as pure structure, a vertical axis with roots in the primordial waters of Nun, trunk rising through the earth, branches reaching toward the imperishable stars. The books of the Netherworld describe this tree as the pathway souls must climb to reach eternal life, suggesting knowledge or transformation rather than simple geography. In Hindu and Buddhist traditions, the Ashvata tree, or Bodhi tree, serves similar functions, but with distinctive details. The Bhagavad Gita describes an inverted tree with roots in heaven and branches growing downward, an image that inverts the expected orientation, but preserves the three-realm structure. This inversion isn't arbitrary. It represents the flow of consciousness from spiritual source downward into material manifestation, souls descending the tree to experience earthly existence before climbing back toward enlightenment. The Buddha achieved awakening sitting beneath a Bodhi tree, and the imagery consistently associates this tree with the transmission of knowledge, the boundary between ignorance and understanding. Mesoamerican world trees appear in Maya codices and temple carvings, often depicted as a ceiba tree with specific attributes. The trunk is marked with symbols representing the earthly realm where humans live. The roots penetrate Xibalba, the watery underworld ruled by death gods. The branches reach toward the celestial realm where creator gods dwell. A serpent typically coils around the trunk, representing the path of knowledge, or the boundary between realms. Birds perch in the upper branches, messengers between gods and humans. The specific details vary, but the structure remains constant across Mesoamerican cultures, from the Olmec through the Aztec, spanning over 2,000 years. Norse mythology includes Yggdrasil, the world tree that connects 9 realms of existence. An eagle perches in its upper branches. A serpent gnaws at its roots. A squirrel runs up and down its trunk, carrying messages between the eagle and serpent, maintaining communication between cosmic extremes. 3 wells sit at the tree's base, sources of wisdom, fate, and sustenance. Gods hold counsel beneath its branches. The tree is described as an ash, providing specific botanical detail unusual in mythology, and its structure governs the universe's fundamental organization. The consistency is remarkable. These aren't vague tree images that might arise independently anywhere. They're detailed cosmological diagrams showing 3 realms connected by a vertical axis, emphasizing bidirectional flow, associating the tree with knowledge and transformation. The symbol appears already complete in the earliest textual sources from each culture, suggesting it wasn't developed gradually, but inherited as a complete symbolic system. The artistic styles differ dramatically, but the underlying concept remains stable across millennia and continents, preserved because it encoded essential information about reality's structure, or because it served as a mnemonic device for knowledge too important to lose.
The spiral appears on Neolithic monuments across Europe, carved into stone before the development of writing, before the establishment of cities, before any of the civilizations we acknowledge. At Newgrange in Ireland, enormous spirals cover the entrance stone. Triple spirals arranged with precise symmetry, carved around 3200 BC by people who supposedly lacked metal tools, possessed no writing system, and lived in small agricultural communities. The spirals are deeply cut, precisely executed, and positioned prominently at the tomb's entrance, where they would have been illuminated by the winter solstice sunrise penetrating the passage. Similar spirals appear at Knowth, Douth, and other Neolithic sites across Ireland. They cover passage tomb walls, entrance stones, and curbstones, sometimes appearing as single spirals, sometimes as doubles, spiraling in opposite directions, sometimes as triples, with 3 separate spirals emerging from a common center. The variety suggests symbolic meaning rather than mere decoration. Single spirals might represent cycles of time or the journey of the soul. Double spirals suggest balance, opposition, complementary forces. Triple spirals could represent the 3 realms of earth, sea, and sky, or birth, life, and death, or past, present, and future. The same symbols appear in Malta's Neolithic temples, carved into stone walls around 3600 BC. They appear at Tarchien, Gigantia, and Menidra, sometimes in isolation, sometimes in complex arrangements with multiple spirals connected by lines, or arranged in patterns suggesting astronomical or geometric relationships. The spiral is clearly significant to temple builders, positioned in areas that suggest ritual importance, carved with care that indicates meaning beyond simple ornamentation. Across the Atlantic, spirals appear throughout Native American rock art, particularly in the American Southwest. At Chaco Canyon, massive spirals are carved on canyon walls, some aligned to mark solstices, when dagger-shaped shadows fall across them at specific times of year. The ancestral Puebloans who created Chaco's elaborate architecture around 1000 AD incorporated spirals into their sacred spaces, suggesting the symbol carried religious or astronomical significance that justified the labor required to create these permanent rock carvings. In Greece, spirals dominate Minoan and Mycenaean art, appearing on pottery, frescoes, jewelry, and architectural elements. In Armenia, spirals appear on carved stones dating to the Bronze Age. In Aboriginal Australian rock art, spirals represent journeys, cycles, water sources, and spiritual concepts, appearing in paintings that may be thousands of years old. The geographic distribution is global. The time depth extends back to humanity's earliest artistic expressions, and the symbol's persistence across cultures and millennia suggests meaning that transcended local beliefs. Spirals aren't universal in the way that simple geometric shapes like circles or straight lines are universal. They're complex enough, specific enough in their execution, that their repeated appearance across disconnected cultures demands explanation. Independent invention remains possible, but the specificity of double and triple spirals, the consistent association with sacred sites and astronomical alignments, the technical precision with which they're executed, all suggest shared origin or common teaching. The spiral encodes knowledge about cycles, about return, about the fact that endings curve back to new beginnings. For cultures rebuilding after catastrophe, for peoples who understood that civilizations rise and fall, the spiral would be a perfect symbol, a reminder that the cycle continues, that collapse isn't the end, that recovery and rebirth remain possible. Before the 20th century poisoned it forever, The swastika was humanity's most widespread symbol, appearing on every inhabited continent, spanning thousands of years, carrying consistently positive meanings across cultures that supposedly never communicated. The word comes from Sanskrit, swastika, meaning well-being or good fortune, but the symbol itself predates Sanskrit by millennia. It appears in Neolithic Europe, ancient India, pre-Columbian America, Bronze Age China, and everywhere humans created permanent art. The symbol isn't just any four-armed design. It's specifically a cross with arms bent at 90-degree angles, all bent in the same direction, creating a sense of rotation, of movement, of cycles turning. This specificity matters. Humans everywhere create crosses, but not everywhere do those crosses develop bent arms rotating in the same direction. The consistency of the swastika's form across vast distances and time periods suggests either impossible coincidence or shared origin. In Hindu and Buddhist traditions, the swastika represents auspiciousness, good fortune, the sun's path across the sky. It appears on temples, manuscripts, religious objects, and domestic items, always carrying positive associations with light, life, and divine blessing. The direction of rotation sometimes varies, clockwise and counterclockwise versions, both appearing with slightly different meanings, but the basic form remains constant. In Native American cultures, particularly the Navajo, Hopi, and other southwestern peoples, the swastika appears on textiles, pottery, and sacred objects, representing the four sacred directions, the sun's movement, or the cycle of seasons. It's called the whirling log, or the four winds, and like Asian versions, it carries meanings of harmony, balance, and natural cycles. In ancient European archaeology, swastikas appear on pottery, tools, and monuments from the Bronze Age onward. Greek, Roman, Celtic, and Germanic peoples all used the symbol, each culture assigning meanings related to solar motion, good fortune, or divine favor. The symbol was common enough that when Heinrich Schliemann excavated Troy in the 19th century and found swastikas on pottery and artifacts, he assumed he'd discovered evidence of Aryan origins, an interpretation that would later be perverted by Nazi ideology into justification for horror. The swastika's universal appearance suggests it encoded essential knowledge. Perhaps it represented the sun's apparent motion across the sky throughout the year. Perhaps it marked celestial pole rotation over precession cycles. Perhaps it simply represented perpetual motion, cycles that turn endlessly. The pattern that governs seasons, generations, the rise and fall of civilizations. Over 200 cultures across 6 continents preserve flood myths, stories of world-destroying deluge, survived by a small group who preserved knowledge for the next age. The details vary, but the core narrative remains stable. Divine warning precedes the flood. A righteous individual or family builds a boat. Animals are preserved. Water covers the earth. The boat comes to rest on a mountain. Survivors repopulate the world and restore civilization. Mesopotamian flood stories from Sumer and Babylon describe Siusudra, or Utnapishtim, building a boat on divine instruction, surviving flood that destroys humanity, landing on Mount Nisir when waters recede. Biblical flood story of Noah follows identical structure, suggesting shared origin rather than independent invention. Greek mythology includes Deucalion, surviving flood sent by Zeus. Hindu texts describe Manu, warned by a fish avatar of Vishnu, building a boat, surviving deluge. Chinese mythology includes Gunyu, taming the Great Flood. Native American tribes across North America preserve flood stories. Australian Aboriginal traditions include flood myths. The list extends across the globe. These aren't just water stories that might arise naturally in any culture near rivers or coasts. They're specific narratives with consistent structure, describing global catastrophe, preservation of knowledge, restart of civilization. If the Younger Dryas involved rapid sea level rise as ice melted, if coastal populations that had developed complex societies were forced to flee to highlands, the flood myths would be cultural memory of real events, garbled through millennia of transmission, but preserving historical truth beneath mythological elaboration. You're back on that museum bench, surrounded by artifacts showing the same symbols repeated across human history. The tree connecting three realms. The spiral marking eternal return. The swastika representing celestial motion. The flood narratives describing catastrophe and survival. These aren't decorations. They're not arbitrary choices made by artists filling space on pottery or temple walls. They're encoded knowledge, information compressed into symbols that could survive the collapse of civilizations, the loss of languages, the forgetting that comes when catastrophe breaks the chain of transmission. If global civilization existed before the Younger Dryas, if knowledge spread through connected populations before sea level rise drowned coastal settlements, then these shared symbols make perfect sense. Their inheritance from the old world, preserved because they encoded essential information about cosmic structure, astronomical cycles, the patterns that govern reality. When populations scattered and isolated following catastrophe, they carried these symbols with them, maintaining them even when original meanings became obscured, teaching them to descendants who preserved the forms while gradually losing understanding of what the forms represented. The symbols became sacred not because gods mandated their use, but because humans recognized their importance, understood viscerally that these patterns mattered, even when intellectual understanding failed. A spiral carved on a tomb wall might have originally served as a mnemonic for astronomical calculations, but later generations who no longer possessed those calculations still recognized the spiral as significant, still preserved it carefully, still taught their children that it meant something important, even if they couldn't articulate precisely what. This is how knowledge survives catastrophe. Not through perfect preservation where nothing is lost, but through imperfect transmission, where forms outlast meanings, where symbols remain, even after explanations fade. The tree of life appears in Sumerian, Egyptian, Hindu, Maya, and Norse traditions, not because these cultures independently invented the same cosmological model, but because they all inherited it from earlier peoples who understood something about reality's structure that later generations preserved in symbol, even after losing it in fact. The symbols are speaking across time, encoding messages from before the catastrophe, waiting for civilizations to develop the sophistication necessary to decode what they mean. But who exactly preserved these symbols through the dark age that followed catastrophe? Who maintained knowledge well enough to pass it forward when populations collapsed and cities drowned? The myths have names for them. The Sumerians called them Anunnaki. Other cultures called them watchers, gods, culture heroes, teachers from elsewhere. For centuries, these beings were interpreted as supernatural entities, divine or alien, anything but human. But what if we've been reading the evidence wrong? What if the Anunnaki weren't visitors from the sky, but survivors from the Highlands? Humans with knowledge, teaching humans without knowledge, remembered as gods because the knowledge gap was vast enough to seem miraculous. Let's examine who the Anunnaki really were. Let's read the actual Sumerian texts carefully, looking at how they're described, how they behave, what they actually do, rather than what later interpreters assumed they must be. Because the texts describe beings who get tired, who argue about work assignments, who eat and drink and scheme and make mistakes. They don't sound like gods. They sound like people. Powerful people, knowledgeable people, people from elsewhere who taught civilization to those who lacked it, but people nonetheless. And if we can understand who they actually were, rather than who we've assumed they must be, we can finally understand where Sumer's sudden sophistication came from. We can understand the restart, rather than the beginning. Let's meet the survivors. Chapter 7. The Anunnaki. Who were they really? You're sitting in the manuscript room of a university library, a clay tablet reproduction in front of you, the original cuneiform text photographed and enlarged so you can see each wedge-shaped mark pressed into clay 4,000 years ago. The tablet is from the Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest written narratives in human history, dated to approximately 1700 BC, but describing events the Sumerians believed occurred at the beginning of time. You're reading a translation, but you keep referring back to the original Sumerian words, because something about the standard interpretation bothers you. Some gap between what the text actually says and what scholars tell you it means. The word keeps appearing. Anunnaki. For over a century it's been translated as those who from heaven to earth came, interpreted as gods descending from celestial realms, divine beings from the sky bringing civilization to primitive humans. The translation shaped how generations of scholars understood Sumerian mythology, creating a framework of sky gods and earth worship that informed everything from academic analysis to popular culture. Ancient astronaut theories built entire edifices on this translation, arguing that the Anunnaki must be extraterrestrial visitors because the text says they came from heaven. But you're looking at the actual Sumerian words now, breaking down the etymology, checking how the same components appear in other contexts. An means sky, heaven, above, but it also means high place, distant location, the far realm. It doesn't exclusively mean supernatural heaven. It can mean the highlands, the mountains, anywhere elevated or remote. Ki means earth, ground, the land where people live. Anunnaki, when you break it down without assuming supernatural meaning, could translate as those from the high place who came to earth, or descendants of the sky god on earth, or even more simply, those from elsewhere. You start reading the descriptions of how the Anunnaki behave, what they do, how they're portrayed in the myths. They get tired. When assigned to dig irrigation canals, they complain about the labor, stage what amounts to a workers' revolt, demand relief from back-breaking physical work. They eat and drink, require sustenance, suffer from exhaustion. They argue in council, debate decisions, sometimes override earlier rulings through political maneuvering. They scheme against each other, form factions, betray alliances. They make mistakes, face consequences, experience fear and anger and jealousy. They travel from place to place, and that travel takes time, requires preparation, involves logistics. Nothing about this sounds like gods in the supernatural sense. It sounds like people. Powerful people, certainly, knowledgeable people who possessed capabilities that impressed those who observed them. People from elsewhere, from outside the normal social structure, from a place called the High Realm, or the Far Place, or simply away. But people, nonetheless, constrained by physical reality, subject to human emotions, operating within natural law rather than violating it through divine miracle. You lean back in your chair, the tablet reproduction still in front of you, and the interpretation that's been building in your mind crystallizes. What if the Anunnaki weren't gods? What if they weren't aliens? What if they were human survivors from before the catastrophe? People who lived in highlands that remained above water when sea levels rose, who preserved knowledge through the Dark Age, who descended to river valleys when climate stabilized, and taught agricultural peoples how to rebuild civilization. What if every strange thing about Sumer, the sudden sophistication, the complete writing system, the advanced mathematics, what if all of it makes perfect sense once you understand that the Anunnaki were humans, teaching humans, implementing inherited knowledge rather than inventing from scratch? The translation of Anunnaki as sky gods creates a supernatural framework that may not match what the Sumerians actually believed. When you examine how Sumerian uses the word An in different contexts, the meaning becomes more flexible than divine heaven. An appears in geographic names for mountain regions. It describes high elevations, plateaus, places above the flatlands. It can mean distant, foreign, from elsewhere. The word carries connotations of height and remoteness, but those meanings don't require supernatural interpretation. Consider the geographic context. Sumer developed in the river valleys of southern Mesopotamia, flatlands between the Tigris and Euphrates, where water and rich alluvial soil supported agriculture. North and east of these valleys, mountains rise, highlands that would have provided refuge when sea levels rose and coastal populations fled inland. The Zagros Mountains, the Armenian highlands, the Anatolian Plateau. All of these elevated regions surround Mesopotamia. All would have remained habitable when lowlands flooded. All could reasonably be called An, the high place, by valley dwellers looking up at peaks. If survivors from before the catastrophe fled to these highlands, preserving knowledge through oral tradition while populations in the valleys lost most of their cultural complexity, then the Anunnaki would be exactly what the name describes. People from the high places who came down to the earth, the lowlands, the river valleys. Their knowledge would have seemed divine to agricultural peoples who had forgotten sophisticated astronomy, mathematics, engineering, and urban planning. Their capabilities would have appeared miraculous, not because they violated natural law, but because the knowledge gap was so vast that advanced technology and systematic knowledge looked like magic to those who lacked it. The texts support this reading.
The Anunnaki aren't described as omnipotent or omniscient. They possess knowledge humans lack, but that knowledge has limits. They can teach irrigation engineering, but they need human labor to actually build the canals. They understand writing and mathematics, but they need scribes to maintain records. They know how to organize cities, but they require human administrators to implement that organization. They're not creating through divine fiat. They're teaching, instructing, transferring knowledge to populations capable of learning and implementing what they're shown. This interpretation explains why the Anunnaki are described as numerous rather than unique. Gods in most traditions are few, special, qualitatively different from humans in ways that can't be bridged. But the texts describe hundreds or even thousands of Anunnaki, suggesting a population rather than a pantheon. They have hierarchies based on function rather than inherent divine nature. Some are administrators,
Some are technical specialists. Some are teachers. Some are laborers. This sounds like a society, a surviving population with internal structure, not a collection of supernatural beings. If the Anunnaki were human survivors with knowledge, teaching humans without knowledge, then the elevation to divine status would have occurred gradually, as later generations forgot the historical context. The teachers became culture heroes. The culture heroes became demigods. The demigods became gods. But beneath the mythological accretion, the texts preserve memories of human interaction, knowledge transmission, the restart of civilization through instruction rather than miraculous intervention. The Atrahasis epic provides the most detailed description of the Anunnaki engaging in physical labor and rebelling against it. The text describes a time before humans existed, when the Anunnaki were responsible for all agricultural work, digging irrigation canals, maintaining waterways, cultivating fields. The work is described as exhausting, backbreaking, unfair. The lesser Anunnaki, those assigned to the hardest labor, begin complaining. They've been digging for 40 years, the text says. Their hands are blistered, their backs are bent. They've had enough. The rebellion is described in detail. The worker Anunnaki gather at night, carrying tools that could serve as weapons. They march to the residence of Enlil, the chief administrator among the Anunnaki, and surround his house. They burn their tools in a bonfire, a symbolic rejection of their assigned labor. Enlil wakes to find his compound surrounded by angry workers demanding change. He calls a council of the senior Anunnaki to address the crisis. The council doesn't simply decree obedience through divine power. They debate. Some argue the workers are right to complain, that the labor is indeed too harsh. Others worry about maintaining authority, about what happens if workers successfully rebel. They discuss options, negotiate solutions, eventually decide to create a new category of laborers to relieve the Anunnaki of the most difficult work. This new category will be humans, created specifically to bear the burden of agricultural labor. The negotiation, the debate, the concern about labor relations. None of this sounds like gods commanding mortals. It sounds like a leadership class dealing with worker unrest, like administrators managing a population with limited patience for unfair conditions. The Anunnaki have power, yes, but that power has limits. They can't simply force compliance. They need to find solutions that address legitimate grievances while maintaining the functions necessary for their society to operate. The creation of humans in this context isn't magical. It's described as a technical process involving biological material and knowledge of anatomy. The details are couched in mythological language, but the basic concept is genetic engineering, or selective breeding, taking existing hominids and modifying them or domesticating them to create a subspecies suitable for labor. This interpretation sounds like science fiction, but it's less implausible than divine miracle, and it matches how the text describes the process when you read it literally rather than metaphorically. What matters for understanding who the Anunnaki were is how they behave in this narrative. They're not omnipotent beings commanding reality through will. They're a population with needs, limitations, and internal politics. They require labor to maintain their society. They face resource constraints that force difficult decisions. They experience conflict between different classes within their social structure. They resolve problems through technological innovation and social reorganization, rather than through supernatural intervention. If the Anunnaki were human survivors from Highlands with knowledge of agriculture, irrigation, and social organization, teaching those skills to valley populations in exchange for labor that built the infrastructure necessary for complex civilization, then the Atrahasis narrative preserves memory of that relationship. The worker Anunnaki would be the teachers and administrators living among the valley peoples. The humans created to relieve them would be the local populations, trained in agricultural techniques and organized into workforces. The mythology preserves the social dynamic while obscuring the historical specifics. The assumption that An means heaven in a supernatural sense creates interpretive problems throughout Sumerian texts. When you read An as simply meaning the high place, the distant realm, the homeland of the Anunnaki somewhere above and away from the river valleys, many passages that seem mystical or supernatural become straightforward descriptions of geography and travel. Texts describe Anunnaki coming from An to Ki, from the high place to the earth. If An is supernatural heaven, this requires miraculous descent through dimensional barriers. But if An is the highlands surrounding Mesopotamia, it just means people traveling from mountains to valleys, a journey that would take days or weeks depending on starting point, but requires no supernatural explanation. The texts describe this journey as taking time, requiring supplies, involving rest stops. This is travel, not teleportation. This is geography, not cosmology. The Anunnaki are described as having a homeland, a place they come from, a region where they dwell when not in the river valleys, teaching and administering. That homeland is called An. It's described as elevated, as having a different climate than the hot valleys, as being mountainous or hilly. These descriptions match the actual highlands surrounding Mesopotamia. The Armenian highlands have cooler temperatures than the Mesopotamian plain. The Zagros Mountains rise dramatically above the valleys. The Anatolian plateau sits elevated and remote from lowland settlements. Archaeological evidence shows that these highland regions were inhabited throughout the periods when Sumer was developing. There were settlements in the mountains, communities that developed in isolation from the valley civilizations, peoples who would have had limited contact with lowlanders, except through trade or occasional migration. If some of these highland communities preserved more knowledge than the valley peoples, if they maintained more complex social organization, if they possessed capabilities that valley dwellers had lost, then they would fit the description of Anunnaki coming from An to teach Ki. The Anunnaki are also described as eventually departing, going back to An, leaving humans to manage civilization independently. In supernatural interpretation, this is God's withdrawing from the world, ending their direct intervention. But in geographic interpretation, it's simply teachers returning home after their work is complete. After the knowledge transfer is finished, after valley civilizations are self-sustaining and no longer require constant instruction, the mythology preserves memory of a transitional period when outside knowledge was necessary, followed by independence once that knowledge was successfully transmitted. DNA evidence from ancient Mesopotamian populations shows genetic diversity consistent with mixture between local populations and migrants from highland regions. The valley populations weren't genetically isolated. They incorporated genetic material from surrounding areas, including the mountains to the north and east. This matches what you'd expect if highland peoples descended to valleys, lived among local populations, intermarried, and eventually either integrated completely or returned to their homelands. leaving genetic traces of their presence. If you synthesize all this evidence, a coherent picture emerges. The Anunnaki were human survivors from highland refuges who preserved knowledge through the Younger Dryas catastrophe. They descended to river valleys when climate stabilized around 9600 BC, teaching agricultural peoples how to implement irrigation, writing, mathematics, astronomy, and urban planning. Their knowledge seemed divine to valley dwellers because the gap was vast, because what they knew had been lost by lowland populations during the catastrophe. They weren't creating civilization from nothing. They were rebuilding it, implementing designs and techniques that had existed before the flood, working from inherited knowledge rather than inventing through trial and error. This explains why Sumer appears suddenly sophisticated. It explains why writing is complete from the start. It explains why mathematical and astronomical knowledge shows up already advanced. The Anunnaki weren't discovering these things. They were teaching them, preserving them, ensuring that the restart happened faster and more successfully than it would have if valley peoples had to rediscover everything independently. You're closing the clay tablet reproduction now, sliding it carefully back into its protective folder, your mind working through implications. If the Anunnaki were human, if they were survivors who chose to preserve and transmit knowledge rather than hoarding it, if they understood that civilization's survival depended on spreading capabilities as widely as possible, then they represent something important. They represent the choice we face. Every civilization reaches a point where it must decide whether knowledge belongs to an elite or to everyone, whether capabilities should be concentrated or distributed, whether preservation means protecting secrets or teaching as many people as possible. The Anunnaki chose distribution. They went to the valleys. They taught. They created systems for transmitting knowledge through writing, through schools for scribes, through standardized curricula that ensured consistent education across generations. They built redundancy into human knowledge because they'd experienced what happens when knowledge is lost. Their approach worked. Sumerian civilization lasted for millennia. The knowledge they encoded in clay tablets survived long enough for us to read it 4,000 years later. The mathematical and astronomical understanding they taught became foundation for everything that came after. Western civilization inherited Greek mathematics and astronomy, but the Greeks learned from the Babylonians, who learned from the Assyrians, who learned from the Akkadians, who learned from the Sumerians, who learned from the Anunnaki. The chain extends back through the catastrophe to whatever came before, preserved because survivors made deliberate choices about how to ensure knowledge outlasted them. We face the same challenge now. We've built impressive capabilities, accumulated vast knowledge, created technologies that would seem divine to people living even a century ago. But how well are we preserving it? How resilient are our systems against disruption? If catastrophe came, if power grids failed permanently, if digital storage became inaccessible, how much of what we know would survive? The Anunnaki chose clay because clay outlasts everything. What are we choosing? And if we're choosing poorly, if we're building fragile systems that depend on continuous technological infrastructure, what will future survivors say about us when they wonder why we didn't learn from those who came before? We've traveled from modern museum basements back through 12,000 years, from clay tablets in London to megaliths in Turkey, from astronomical alignments in England and Peru to technological artifacts that shouldn't exist. from serpent teachers remembered across continents to symbols shared by cultures that never met. From myths about floods and gods to the recognition that beneath mythology lies history. That the Anunnaki weren't supernatural beings, but human survivors teaching human descendants. That civilization didn't begin with Sumer, but restarted there. That we're not the first to reach these heights, and we won't be the last unless we learn what the evidence is showing us. But there's one final piece, one more layer to examine before we can understand what all this means for us today. Because the Sumerians didn't just preserve knowledge in clay tablets, describing irrigation and mathematics and astronomy. They preserved warnings. They pressed into clay their understanding of cycles, their awareness that civilization rises and falls, their insights about what causes collapse and how survivors can prepare for it. Most of those tablets sit untranslated in museum storage. 80% of Sumerian literature still waiting for scholars willing to read what they contain. What are we missing? What did they try to tell us? What warnings did they encode about the cycle we're still caught in? Let's go to those tablets one more time, to the warnings that matter now more than ever, to the knowledge that could help us break the pattern if we're finally willing to listen. The conclusion is waiting, and it's not about the past. It's about what comes next, about whether we'll repeat the cycle or finally learn from it, about the choice we're making right now, through action or inaction. Let's see what they were trying to save us from. The cycle and the warning. You're standing again in that basement archive beneath the British Museum. But now, it's the end of a long journey, rather than the beginning. The clay tablet in your hands feels heavier now. Weighted not with physical mass, but with understanding. Around you, metal drawers stretch into shadows, each containing hundreds of tablets. 80% of Sumerian literature still untranslated, still waiting for someone willing to read what they tried so desperately to preserve. The tablet you're holding describes cycles. The Sumerians understood something we've forgotten. Civilization doesn't climb upward forever. It rises, flourishes, reaches heights of sophistication and capability, then collapses. Sometimes gradually, sometimes catastrophically, but the pattern repeats. Rise and fall. Complexity followed by simplification. And they knew this not through philosophy, but through inherited memory. They were the restart. They were the generation that rebuilt after everything was lost. So here's what 12,000 years of evidence whispers, if you're willing to listen. Around 10,800 BC, the Younger Dryas brought Ice Age conditions back for 1,300 years. Any civilization that existed before this catastrophe faced collapse. Coastal settlements drowned when ice melted. Agricultural systems failed. Trade networks broke. Knowledge stored in perishable forms was lost. The archaeological record shows a gap, a dark age, a period when human capability declined because the systems supporting complexity couldn't survive disruption. But some survived in highlands that remained above water, in regions that stayed marginally habitable. These survivors carried fragments of knowledge from before the flood. They built Gobekli Tepe, around 9600 BC, as monument and backup system, encoding knowledge in stone that would outlast languages. Then they buried it to protect it, trusting future generations would dig and understand. Over 6,000 years, populations recovered. Survivors scattered, some staying in highlands, others descending to river valleys. They taught descendants the fragments they'd preserved. The megalithic monuments rising globally after the Younger Dryas mark this process. Standing stones built by peoples implementing inherited designs, following blueprints passed through generations. By 3200 BC, conditions were finally stable enough for complete restart. Sumer emerged not because humans suddenly invented civilization, but because survivors' descendants finally had means to implement what had been preserved through 6 millennia of Dark Age. The writing was complete because it was reconstructed from earlier models. The mathematics was sophisticated because it was teaching rather than discovery. The urban planning was confident because it followed proven principles. The Anunnaki weren't gods from sky. They were humans from Highlands, carrying knowledge that valley peoples had lost. Teaching because they understood that distributed knowledge survives better than hoarded secrets. The Sumerians feared forgetting more than death. They pressed knowledge into clay because clay outlasts everything. They made thousands of copies because single points of failure guarantee loss. They trained scribes across generations because knowledge existing in only one generation is knowledge at risk. They built redundancy into every system because they remembered what happens when redundancy fails. And then they tried to warn us. The tablets speak of cycles, of the fact that what rises must fall, that every civilization faces tests it may not pass, that preparation and preservation are the only insurance against total loss. But 80% sit untranslated, warnings unread, knowledge locked behind institutional inertia and unwillingness to prioritize ancient wisdom over contemporary concerns. Maybe the cycle turns again. Maybe we face our own catastrophe, our own collapse, forcing survivors to restart from fragments. Or maybe we're the generation that finally breaks the pattern, that learns from those who came before, that builds systems preserving knowledge across deep time, rather than assuming progress is permanent. The choice is ours, through decisions we make about what to preserve and how, about whether we prioritize resilience or efficiency, about whether we build for ourselves or for descendants facing conditions we can't imagine. The Sumerians did their part. They encoded warnings in clay, buried monuments in stone, created redundant systems that worked well enough that we're reading their tablets 4,000 years later. They broke the cycle for themselves, restarting faster than possible if survivors had lost everything. But each generation faces the same test. Each civilization must choose whether to heed warnings or ignore them, whether to prepare for disruption or assume it won't come. You set the tablet down carefully. The basement is quiet, except for climate control hum maintaining conditions that will preserve these fragments another 4,000 years. If we maintain the electricity, the institutions, the stability, keeping museums functioning. If. The Sumerians didn't rely on if. They built systems that worked regardless, that required no continuous infrastructure, that could survive collapse and still transmit knowledge to whoever found them. That's the lesson. That's the warning we're not hearing, because we assume we're too advanced to fail, too sophisticated to lose what we've built, too different from every civilization that thought the same before collapse. We're not the pinnacle. We're the latest iteration in a cycle that has turned before and will turn again. Unless we finally understand what the stones and the clay and the buried monuments are telling us, the mysteries may not be solved in our lifetime, The 80% of untranslated tablets may sit in basements another century. We may repeat the cycle, losing what we've built, forcing future generations to rediscover what we knew. Or maybe not. Maybe we'll be the generation that breaks the pattern, that learns from survivors, that builds systems designed to outlast catastrophe. The choice is ours. The warnings are written in clay. The question is whether we'll read them before it's too late. If this journey moved something in you, if you feel deep time pressing against the present, leave a comment about what you'll remember. And if you want to continue exploring what history tried to erase, I'll be waiting in the next video. On the other side of sleep, where stones still speak, and clay still remembers. And the question of whether we break the cycle or repeat it remains unanswered, hanging in the balance, waiting for what we do next.